Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, after the birth of my baby Harry, my mother-in-law Maggie was doggedly determined that I was not going to return to work, like she had done when my husband Ian had been born. Maggie was an effusive, gregarious character who'd been deeply entrenched in the fashion industry. She had jet-setted around the globe with her fabulous designer creations. She would watch top models modelling some of her upmarket exclusive designer ranges that had been particularly popular in Milan and Paris. She would also frequent London Fashion Week, Milan Fashion Week, and New York Fashion Week. Maggie had been incredibly passionate about fashion. Leaving her son Ian in the charge of a nanny was the biggest compunction in her entire life. Maggie is sitting with me in my baby's nursery. Although she's no longer in the fashion industry, the residue of her career can be clearly seen, not only in her elegant, flamboyant, rather chic deportment, but by everything she wears, and more to the point, how she actually wears it. My mother-in-law can make a dowdy pair of jeans look like $1 million, with the use of jackets, scarves, costume jewellery and belts. Today she is wearing a classic Chanel navy blue dress, with a string of pearls, staring adoringly at her grandchild's cot. She looks every part the most adoring grandmother, completely obsessed, enchanted and besotted by her grandson. "Doesn't he look just like Ian?" she says proudly. "You think so?" I ask. I can't help thinking at this age my baby doesn't look like anyone particular. Maggie looks at me with a wholehearted, resolute expression upon her face. She clasps her hands tightly together in a prayer-like position. "Please, please, Victoria dear, don't you dare ever go back to work. Well, not at the moment anyway. I beg you. If there's any self-reproach or contrition I have in my life, it's going straight back to work in the fashion industry when Ian was born. I missed out on so much. I've always regretted it with a wistful, nostalgic longing, as if I could go back in time. By golly, I would do things differently." "Maggie, you had a phenomenal career in the fashion industry. Oh, come on, you don't regret that, surely. Think about all the exemplary designer creations that were setting the catwalks alight with your bedazzling designs. That's art. How could you ever be remorseful about that?" "Actually, I am, dear. Very much, if you must know. I'll tell you what's good about being in my 60s. I've actually grown up. I ruefully regret that it took me so long to get my head together. I must say I like myself much more as an older person now. The problem is when I was so young, I was so naive, immature, driven, impetuous, flighty, impulsively ambitious. Let's just say I think that those are the unfortunate adjectives that best describe me. I placed so little significance on what actually mattered. But when you get to my ripe, wizened old age, you begin to learn that the only things of any real consequence and of momentous noteworthiness are those you love, your friends, your family. When you're younger, your priorities are warped. When I was 25, I was shooting for the stars. I was so self-absorbed. Are you saying if you could do things differently, you would? Oh, definitely. I regret not being there when my son said his first word, when he took his first steps. That time in a baby's life goes by far too fast. And not to be part of your child's metamorphosis, I think, is such a dreadful pity. If you ask any mother, they will tell you that where did the time go to when my child was a baby, as it went so fast. But I really want to go back to my job, I exclaimed. Well, I'm sure you can make a plan, dear. Later on, though. Work part-time, perhaps. But not at this critical time in your son's life. I really believe he needs his mother. I promise you that you'll be so glad you took my sagacious advice. I'm not just a pretty face, you know. One day you'll be thanking me. You'll be glad you were there when your son had his first birthday, rather than cleaning someone's bedpan in a hospital. Think about it. What is more efficaciously profitable to you emotionally? Well, when you put it like that, I think being at my son's first birthday trumps cleaning someone's bedpan any time of the week. Exactly, my dear. Finally she gets it, says Maggie, looking at me, as if the weight of the world has been lifted off her shoulders. My baby begins to cry. Maggie lifts him out of his cot very tenderly, putting my 2-month-old son onto her knee. She begins to rock him gently in her arms. There, little one, she says, kissing Zack on the forehead. Zack immediately begins to calm down. He gurgles jubilantly. A little smile is on his bonny face as he stares up at Maggie with bright big blue eyes. He regurgitates some of my milk all over Maggie's perfect blue Chanel dress, but she doesn't even bat an eyelid. It's rather amusing to see my stylish-looking mother-in-law covered with my baby's vomit, as there would have been a time when she would have been repulsed by her dress being soiled like this, but not any more. I pass her a damp piece of kitchen towel. Once she replaces Zack in his cot, she wipes her dress down with a huge grin on her face. Oh, babies, she laughs. They do make such a mess. I must admit, in her company, I do feel rather dowdy. I've never been very fashionable myself. I tend to dress for comfort, but Maggie seems to like the fact that I'm prudently down to earth, so that's a very good thing. As acrimonious as she was so good with my son. Ian loved her to death. I was gutted when his first words were Nana, and not Mama or Dada. Well, it's hardly surprising, I say. I mean, his nanny was around him all the time. You and your husband were working full-time. Well, that's my point, dear. Someone else was looking after my baby. Ian was bonding with a stranger. Sometimes when I would pick him up in my arms, he would start screaming and having a tantrum. Then Nanny Curtis would take him away from me and put him in her arms, and she would calm him down at once. It made me feel like my baby wasn't even my own. I mean, I should have been the one calming my baby down, certainly not Nanny Curtis. I used to feel surplus to requirements, almost as if my baby didn't even belong to me. It's rather like owning a beautiful dress that you lend to somebody else, and you're consumed with the green-eyed monster, as you want to be wearing that dress yourself. You're wondering why you ever lent it to a perfect stranger or even a friend. You really regret it. And by the way, while we're on the subject of nannies, dear, you absolutely need to get help with baby Zack, as looking after a baby is exhausting, very draining, a plethora of work. You want to thoroughly enjoy every minute of being a mother. You could get yourself an au pair or a nanny to help you share the responsibility, so you can still function efficiently, with someone helping you around the house. It'll mean you can shoot off to town, enjoy a coffee and adult company with your friends. It's imperative for you to have some quality time to yourself, or you might begin to start resenting your own baby, and you certainly don't want that to happen with precious little Zack. When Maggie had left, I reflected on her shrewd, judicious words. I always think young people should listen to older people, perspicacious advice. You can learn from their mistakes. I was amazed that Maggie so wished she had spent more time with her baby, rather than showing off her dazzling creations down some of the illustrious catwalks in both Paris and Milan. That was sententiously eye-opening and evocatively redolent to me. It would make perfect sense to me, as a child is a baby for such a short period of time, and missing out on your baby growing up seems like an awful pity. I do know that mothers get exhausted and completely overwhelmed. All parents need a break from their children to enjoy some adult company. I decided my mother-in-law was absolutely right. So began my search for a nanny for little Zack. I would pay them to help me around the house and to babysit Zack when I went out. Of course, I had heard shuddersome stories about people who had hired insouciant and apathetically negligent nannies, with disastrous repercussions. Ostensibly, for me, bringing someone you didn't know to live with us under my roof was rather scary. I knew I'd have to take the interview business rather seriously. It seemed that everyone that came to my door for an interview was not suitable. I needed to feel a compatible rapport with the nanny, if she was going to live with me under my roof with me and my husband, becoming a harmonious member of our family. I think the agency I was dealing with thought I was over-particular, far too fussy. But Mrs. Rockingham, they'd say to me, I assure you that Nicole is an excellent nanny. She comes with brilliant references. I don't care how good her references are, I would say. I've got to live with this girl under my roof. And if I don't like her, and there's no mutual conviviality between us, this arrangement will never ever work. I could almost hear them sighing on the other end of the phone in exasperation, as if I was being unreasonably difficult and asking for way too much. I'm almost certain they'd say to their colleagues, It's that punctilious taxing woman again, Mrs. Rockingham. It seems there's no pleasing some people. The woman is so ponderously demanding. I don't care how much I frustrated them, as my standards were high. I was being very particular about the type of person I was looking for. I'm sorry I wasn't simply prepared to settle for the status quo. I didn't want to be one of those people who went through a plethora of nannies like a bag of burritos or a box of chocolate candies. In truth, I just didn't warm to any of the nannies I met, for there was always something bothersome about them that niggled me. I'm a great believer in trusting your instincts. I met young, giggly, bemused, inattentive girls who seemed that they were easily distracted by their boyfriends calling them on their cell phones, so they might not concentrate on little Zack, who was my greatest priority. Many of these young women may have been as frivolous as Maggie when she was their age. Then there was the condescending type that I would dread having in my house. They'd probably make me feel like an atrocious mother and be quick to point out all my grievous mistakes. I could see by their surly, humorless faces that having them in my house would be as much fun as living with Scrooge from the Christmas Carol, a pretty miserable experience. Luckily, in the end, it was my mother-in-law Maggie who came through for me. She said she knew of an excellent nanny from Norway who had American ancestry on her father's side. It appears her dad was born in North Carolina. I was to learn that this lovely young lady was hoping to live in America one day, and would love to have a live-in job as a nanny, in order to decide whether in the long term she would consider emigrating here. She was such a nice, down-to-earth girl. Her name was Layla Stratton. I think you're going to like her. She's got a quirky personality, a dry sense of humour. I think the two of you will hit it off right away. I happen to think she's a keeper. So Layla Stratton moved into our farmhouse that is situated outside of Portland, northeast from Salem, and close to the Silver Falls State Park, where our family lives, in a colonial revival 2-story white farmhouse with a grey slate roof, black shutters, and a pedimented doorway with porch. From the moment I met Layla, we clicked and had a mutual affection for each other. Truly, I don't know how I would have managed without her. It was great to have her convivial company when I felt like having a glass of wine from the Willamite Valley with an adult. She was indispensable in every regard to me, especially when my son suffered from terrible colic. Layla was delighted to move into my farmhouse. She loved the countryside, was a keen rider, so the two of us would sometimes go riding together on some of the riding trails close to the house when my husband would watch over little Zack for us. Layla described herself as the quintessential country girl, who actually could never envisage herself living in a city. She loved the fact that we had chickens ambling around our farmhouse, horses frolicking happily in the meadows, and that we had a stable block, a barn, an orchard, a large pond, and a wood grove. One day when I returned to my farmhouse, having had coffee with friends in town, I popped to the store to buy a few groceries, and returned home with a brown bag in my hand, putting it onto the kitchen counter, along with my purse and car keys. I entered the kitchen. Everything seemed airily quiet. All I could hear was the ominous ticking of the kitchen clock, that seemed unusually loud. "Layla! Layla, I'm back!" But there was no response. I was bewildered to see that the back kitchen door had been left wide open, which was exceedingly unusual. I closed it, thinking that Layla must have accidentally left it open. I glanced briefly out of the window. I could see 3 of our horses romping happily in the field. "Layla, are you there?" I called. "I'm back." But there was no answer. I quickly darted up the sweeping ornate oakwood staircase, calling Layla's name again. "Layla! Layla, where are you? Layla! Layla!" But there was absolutely no response. It was very weird. Where the heck was she? I dashed into my son's pale yellow nursery and was relieved to see Zack lying fast asleep in his cot. But Layla, she was nowhere to be found. Stranger still was the baby monitor wasn't connected. That was exceedingly unusual. Layla always put the baby monitor on. She would never leave Zack unattended, but then where on earth was she? I began calling Layla's name, frantically searching every room in the house. I entered her bedroom. Her bed, as usual, was meticulously made. Her clothes were neatly lined up in the closet. Her purse, cell phone and car keys were sitting on the dressing table. So Layla hadn't even gone out. But where was she? I darted out of the house, wondering if Layla had gone out for a breath of fresh air. I searched the stable block extensively, the barn, the meadows, but Layla was nowhere to be found. Now I was getting unduly concerned. I could feel a bitter nausea rising up in the back of my throat. Something wasn't right. Even my stomach was churning violently, while my heartbeat had increased significantly, as it drummed loudly in my chest. "Don't panic," I told myself. "Calm down. Maybe she went for a walk in the wood grove." That was it, I told myself. Of course, she went for a walk in the woods. She never abandoned Zack before. But then, of course, there was a first time for everything. I began to hastily run into the woods. It was a magnificently beautiful morning. The wood grove twinkled in the morning light. The tall, big leaf maples, the white oaks and ponderosa pines, all well advanced in maturity, rose up into the sky like masterful, viridescent skyscrapers. I'd always appreciated the oak trees in our woods, as they are fabulously big, impressively imposing, with wide outstretched arms that effusively welcome me, always like reliable friends that you can trust. The atmosphere in the wood this morning was so congenial, tranquil and very uplifting. So much so that for a brief moment I almost forgot my angst. Well, almost. I was transfixed by this mesmerizing space. For me, this woodland sanctuary always uplifted my spirits. The canopy above my head sprinkled its sparkling gossamer light onto the dark, fertile earthen floor, peppering it in different light shades. The verdant feathery ferns, variegated ground covers, Spanish mosses swept across the ground in a rich green, resplendent, textured carpet. It was so magnificent to behold. I could hear the sweet trills and tweets of the birds filtering through the pleasing sanctuary. And then I froze when I discovered Layla's yellow flowery scarf, entangled in a bramble bush, caught up in the thorny briars. Now I was grievously concerned. It certainly meant that Layla had been in the woods. I called out her name, running up and down the undulating trails, but there was no answer. I was now really rather frightened. I had to return to the farmhouse, but I wasn't certain what I should do. Did I call the police, or was I overreacting? I mean, maybe she would be coming back in any moment. I decided to give Layla an extra hour. That's what I would do. And if she hadn't returned, I would then definitely call the police. I quickly made myself a cup of coffee to calm my frazzled nerves, and I looked in on my baby Zack. Where was Layla? Where was she? An hour later I'd phoned up the police. I did feel a level of reassurance when the police vehicle drove up my drive. Its wheels crunched the pebbles beneath hardy rubber tyres. 2 officers climbed out of the vehicle. I heard the knocker being rapped. I quickly answered the door, dutifully guiding both the officers into my living room. "I'm Officer Jones. This is Officer Miller. How can we be of help to you?" "Please take a seat," I said, pointing to the upholstered chairs in my living room. Both men sat side by side on the settee, looking authoritative and businesslike, which brought me a measure of reassurance. These astute, sharp-witted men would find Layla. I was sure of it. Officer Jones looked like the more senior detective. He appeared to be in his 60s, while the other officer looked considerably younger, as if he was in his 30s. Officer Jones brought out a notepad from his pocket. He studied me intently, through shrewd, assertive brown eyes. "So you say that your nanny has gone missing?" That's right, I said. Look, I don't know if I'm overreacting, officers. All I know is she should be back at the moment, but it's not like her to go off like this. She's been working for me for over a year now. I know her very well. I find her to be considerably reliable. Also, her SUV is parked in our driveway. I checked her bedroom. Her car keys, cell phone and wallet are both on her dressing table. Now, she'd never leave without them, so this is exceedingly odd. I don't understand where she could have got to. I agree. It is very peculiar, said Officer Miller, rubbing a finger across his cleanly shaven chin. So you believe her going off like this is enigmatic behaviour? Most definitely, officers. This is incongruous behaviour for her at the best of times. I searched for her absolutely everywhere. I did find her yellow scarf caught up in the briars in the woodgrove. Both of the officers exchanged concerned looks between each other.
We'll be needing that scarf for DNA analysis, he said. Now, could you tell me what Layla looks like?
Well, she's half Norwegian, half American. Her dad's actually from North Carolina. She's quite tall, about 5'7", 5'8", I think. Slender with long blonde hair that's very straight and shiny, with bangs. She has fair skin, blue eyes. She's pretty.
Do you know what she was wearing today?
I tried to rack my brains. What was she wearing? I'm sorry, Detective, I said, waving my hand. I'm just trying to think for a moment. She's a quirky bohemian dresser. Let's see. Yes, she was wearing white pants this morning. A long mustard jersey jacket sweater. It trailed beyond her knees. The yellow scarf as well, but as you know, that got caught up in the briars. I think she was also wearing a white blouse with a thin gold belt. That's right, she was wearing a gold belt. Officer Miller scribbled all the details down attentively.
Do you have a photograph of your nanny on hand?
Yes, I do. Hold on a second. I won't be a minute, I said, dashing to the kitchen area of our open-plan living room cum kitchen. I quickly opened my purse, pulling out my cell phone. Briefly clicking onto the photograph section, I paused for a moment to make a decision. This is a good one, I think. I have a photograph here, I say to the officers. They both take a snap of my picture on their cell phones.
Was there anything uncustomary, ma'am, when you came back from coffee with your friends this morning?
Yes, actually there was. I noticed the baby monitor was off, which is exceedingly unusual. You see, this is a big farmhouse, so we leave the monitor on at all times. Oh yes, and the back kitchen door was left wide open. It's never left open like that, which was decidedly odd and atypical. This time it was the young Officer Miller who asked me a question.
Ma'am, if I may trouble you for a moment, I'd like to ask you about your nanny's demeanour of late. She hasn't been depressed recently, or troubled in any way. You haven't seen any changes in her personality?
No, she's always easygoing, fun-loving, happy, cracking jokes. This morning was no different to that.
So what was the last thing she was doing this morning? Can you remember?
Well, she was eating a cream cheese bagel. She was drinking coffee at about 8 o'clock in the morning.
Do you mind, ma'am, if we take a quick look around the place? We'll also need a DNA sample from her hairbrush. Is that all right with you?
Officer Miller was on his cell phone, asking for a couple of people to bring over some sniffer dogs to the house. I'm surprised, I said. I thought you needed 72 hours before you search for a missing person.
Depends on the case, really. This one is idiosyncratic and rather unorthodox. And given you found that scarf on some thorny briars, we need to search the woodgrove to see if the sniffer dogs pick up a scent. We'll also be checking your pond, obviously.
The police arrived on the scene. They began to thoroughly search for Layla everywhere, but there appeared to be no sight or sound of her. Did the dogs pick up anything? I asked.
Yes, they picked up her trail in the woods, but then it comes to a very mysterious, rather ambiguous, paradoxical, almost abrupt end. Very bizarre indeed. But for a moment we've done all we can do. But we will certainly keep you posted at all times. It will seem that your nanny did go into the woods, but the scent trail just stops. Very curious indeed.
So you think she definitely went into the woods then?
It would seem so.
For the next couple of days the police continued to search for Layla, without much luck. She had been registered as a missing person. Her DNA had also been put on record.
It would seem like many of those 411 cases you hear about, Layla had elliptically disappeared into thin air, and both my husband and my mother-in-law were exceedingly troubled about Layla's welfare, for none of us could comprehend what had happened to her.
"This is very peculiar, darling," Maddie said to me. "It strikes me as exceedingly odd that Layla goes into the wood grove, the sniffer dogs lose her scent near an oak tree. I mean, how on earth does that ever happen?" "I don't know," I said. "I agree with you. It is idiosyncratic behaviour for Layla. She was such an authentic, dependable nanny. I don't honestly know what's going on." "Well, I spoke to Officer Jones. It seems he can't get hold of the Strattons, that's Layla's parents. I gather they're celebrating their 20th wedding anniversary. The husband took his wife somewhere remote, very obscure, so they can't contact them. But maybe in the circumstances it's a good thing, because I really believe we're going to find her. I'm sure we are." "You do?" I asked. "Well, I do, as it happens. I'm quite intuitive. I really believe she's still alive." "Well, Officer Jones thinks something nefarious could have happened to her. He says it's a possibility. He believes she might have been running from someone because of her scarf being caught up in those briars. He thinks they could have kidnapped or abducted her. He said that's a distinct possibility." "Of course, we do have to consider that," says Maddie. "He's right about that. Anything could have happened to her. But let's not jump to conclusions until we have some proper answers. And let's keep our fingers crossed that Layla will turn up as right as rain." It was on the 4th night that I suddenly woke with a start, almost certain I'd heard something, but I wasn't quite sure what. I sat up and listened intently. I knew I'd heard something, and then I heard it again. It sounded like someone was banging on the kitchen door very, very loudly. So I immediately bounded down the staircase like a jackrabbit, racing to the door, my heart pounding in my chest violently. Please God, may that be Layla," I was praying inwardly. So imagine my surprise when I was to discover that Layla was indeed at our front door. There were leaves and twigs in her hair. Dirt was strewn all over her face. Her white trousers were badly shredded. She was covered in dirt. "Where have you been?" I asked, taking Layla into my arms. "We've been worried sick about you. What happened to you?" Layla's story. I was sitting in the kitchen on a high chair, around the kitchen island, with the white quartz countertops, thoroughly enjoying my cream cheese bagel, served with a piping hot cup of coffee, while I was flicking through the pages of a magazine, reading some of the articles. "Bye, Layla. I'm going now," Victoria says to me. "I'm just popping into town to have some coffee with friends. How do I look?" she says, doing a twirl. "You look amazing, Victoria." Victoria never normally wears dresses, but on this specific occasion she was wearing a cream tunic dress with a black belt and black court shoes, and she looked phenomenal. "What's the occasion?" I asked. "Well, it's just one of my friends, you know. She always goes to such effort to look smart, so I decided to make an effort for the occasion. I'm usually just so casual, aren't I?" "Well, you look $1 million today. When will you be back?" "I'm not sure. I won't be long. I'll pick up some groceries on the way." "Rightio. See you soon." I hear the whooshing sound of Victoria's car wheels driving down the pebbly path, and then a strange noise grabs my attention. It sounds like something with ponderous footsteps is standing outside the kitchen door. This is when I suddenly discern a big black shadowy creature in our backyard. It was looking in at me inquisitively through the kitchen door. I realised to my amazement this is an abominable snowman, or what you call in America a Bigfoot. The creature sees me. I can see he's not pleased to be seen. He quickly scurries away into the woodgrove. When the creature had looked at me, I had discerned his kind eyes that were the colour of treacle. He also had a human face that looked so gentle and benevolent. I wasn't afraid of him at all, despite his gargantuan size. In truth, he had the eyes of a lovable teddy bear that you just wanted to hug. I could see he was 8 foot tall, about 700 pounds, and built like a burly piece of farming machinery. So I ran surreptitiously after him. I was so curious. I never normally would have acted so impulsively like this, but it's not every day you see an abominable snowman. I remember growing up in Norway once. We had to write an essay in school of what kind of fairy tale-like creature we would love to encounter in real life, if only it were real, that is. Many of the kids in my class wrote about unicorns, fairies, gnomes, extraterrestrials, dinosaur, and even the Loch Ness Monster from Scotland. My essay was about the abominable snowman. I had to read my essay to the entire class because it was so good. It was like I'd always had an inner hankering to see one of these creatures, but never for a single moment did I think that they were real. But now I was seeing one. I was not going to miss out on having a closer look at this creature. I might never get a second chance. I clandestinely entered the woodgrove with a cautious approach, but I snagged my scarf on a bunch of briars, but I ignored it, and tiptoed lightly on my feet, behind one tree after another. This outlandish critter has captivated my intrigue, hijacked my attention. Even my responsibilities as a nanny are thrown to the wayside like an abandoned bag of schoolbooks. I don't want the Bigfoot to know I'm following it. It seems so shy and evasive. I'm hoping I'll get a better look at him. I hide in the woodgrove, watching this black Bigfoot who's ambling over to this bush of berries. He's eating them, blindly oblivious to the fact that I've actually followed him, and that I'm hiding behind a tree, watching him intently. I am blown away by how magnificent he is. The next thing I know is there's a discomposing growling sound that reverberates throughout the woodgrove, with an ear-piercing vibration that could almost shatter glass. I tremble in terror. Before I see anything, I sense an intimidating, threatening presence that feels bodefully dangerous and very claustrophobic, as if something quite treacherous is drawing close to me. I turn around in abject horror to see this huge auburn-headed Bigfoot standing only a hair's breadth away from me. I had not heard his stealthful approach, but I had sensed it and smelt it. This formidable Bigfoot pulls back his thin lips to expose his huge white human-like teeth. He's glaring at me with very menacious eyes that give off a malevolent red eye-shine. Everything about this Bigfoot's demeanour is intrinsically evil, full of a tangible hatred, almost as if every cell in his body is screaming, "Killer! Killer!" He is polar opposite to the black Bigfoot in every conceivable way, as dramatic as black is to white, as good is to evil, as an apple is from a pear. I cannot describe the fear that incarcerates every blood cell of my body, completely paralysing my adrenal response, immobilising my knees so that my legs crumble beneath me, like jelly. My heart pounds violently in my chest. I audibly hear every single beat. My mind has become clouded by a foggy, clawing mist, obscuring all my thoughts, that whirl around my head like the clothes in a spin-dryer. I have no comprehension how to react to this Bigfoot. I am so gripped by terror that I am rendered completely helpless, so that I almost surrender to its mercy. But he has none. He has me cornered from every side, unable to run away. I can smell his putrid breath misting up my face. I perceive he derives great pleasure from my trepidation, rather like a cat toying with its prey. With one powerful overlong arm he tugs me, grabbing me with one hand, tossing me up in the air as if I'm a ball. For a moment I'm airborne. As my body is launched into the air, it begins to fall. Down, down, down. I'm free-falling, as if I'm on a parachute. I scream at the top of my lungs. I know I'm about to end up pulverised on the forest floor. But the Bigfoot catches me in time. I knew he was toying with me. He tosses me up in the air again, for a second time. I feel almost resigned to my plight, almost as if my life is precariously hanging by a fine thread that will very soon be snapped. I close my eyes tightly to brace for impact. This time I'm caught by the black Bigfoot, who throws me on his back. He runs away with me into the woods. The relief I feel is immense. I know I'm in safe hands. The red-headed Bigfoot is running after us, screaming like a banshee. But for some strange, incongruous reason, he doesn't tackle the black Bigfoot, whom I notice is wearing an interesting leather bracelet upon his wrist. I'm not exactly sure why the red Bigfoot doesn't challenge him, but he certainly looks as mad as hell, and is still following us. Finally, the dark Bigfoot is climbing up the rocky elevation that could not easily be tackled by a human being unless they were using ropes and mountain climbing gear. But this critter jumps up the rocks with a fluid buoyancy, like a cat bouncing gracefully off a kitchen cabinet. He is like an acrobat in his movements. They're so fluid, powerful and agile, even with me slung over his shoulders. Before I know it, I find myself in a sprawling cave, where there's a substantial-sized female Bigfoot, along with her daughter, standing there in the cave, somewhat obscured by the darkness. But I see them more clearly when my eyes begin to adjust to the dimness. I realize it is the older son that rescued me from that rang-a-tang-coloured Bigfoot. When the male Bigfoot sees his mother, he engages in a deep, earnest conversation with her. They're talking together backwards and forwards in a very strange language. Their voices sound solemn and very troubled. The Bigfoot female is looking at me. She nods. I knew she was speaking about me, but I wasn't certain what she was saying. But she's not at all unfriendly. On the contrary, her benevolent eyes twinkle with a warm, generous kindness. The female Bigfoot turns around. She looks at me through her deep-set dark eyes. I hear her saying in my head, "You'll be safe here. You can only go back home when Bidzil gets back, when he gives you a leather bracelet to wear. Otherwise you won't be safe, as Gwitsi from the Bagalona clan will surely kill you. He's marked you as his own, or he'll keep you as his woman." I nodded in agreement. I could see that this Bigfoot family was so generously kind, and they knew what they were talking about. There's no way I want to be anywhere near that iniquitous red-headed Bigfoot. I glanced briefly around the cave. It's pleasantly cosy and snug, generously lined with deer skins. Deer antlers are hanging on the cave walls, rather like decorations. Surprisingly, it smells like the woods. There are sticks on the floor that are lined up in blocks, covered with moss and deer skins, and when you lay back on the bedding, it's pleasingly comfortable. I glance out of the cave. I knew without the Bigfoot's help, there was no way I'd be able to walk down these rocky outcrops, as they're so sheer. When I glance out of the cave, I can see the red-headed Bigfoot sitting there on one of the rocks further away, with his overlong, powerful legs dangling over a rocky ledge. It's like he's laid claim on me, and is waiting for me to be his. He seems determined to get his trophy. For the next 3 days I see him hanging around on that rocky ledge, patiently waiting and waiting and waiting. I knew there was no way I could leave this cave until Bidzil got back, whom I gather was the head of the Bigfoot family. I am informed that he is the most powerful Bigfoot in these parts, respected by all the different Bigfoot clans. And if he puts a special leather necklace around my wrist, all the Bigfoot clans will know that it's from Bidzil, and that I belong to him. He's marked me as his own, so they cannot touch me in any way. He is so highly regarded in these parts. If another Bigfoot clan, for example, kills a deer, and Bidzil puts a leather bracelet on the deer, they have to hand it over to him, as everything he marks with a leather thong belongs to him. The Bigfoot family were very kind to me. I ate roots, berries, apples and nuts with the Bigfoots. They offered me some of their meat. I didn't want to eat anything raw, so the Bigfoot female, understanding my dilemma, made a fire especially for me. She rubbed 2 sticks together so effortlessly, and the fire was made. I could cook my own venison. She told me sometimes they cook their meat, especially in winter when it's cold. They collected water from the stream, using old Coca-Cola bottles that were made from glass. I noticed that there were always bottles available in the cave, full of water, which I would drink. The Bigfoot family taking care of me leave the cave at will to hunt, explore, to play, or forage for food. They all wear a personally designed Bidzil leather bracelet on their wrists, made especially for them, which means that the red-haired Bigfoot or any other Bigfoots can never attack them. Outside the cave entrance is a long leather creation that rather reminds me of a dream catcher. There are eagle feathers attached to it, and it's very attractive. I fancy it for myself, actually. I'd hang it on my bedroom wall. I gather it's known as a natsalid, which means a rainbow seal of protection. What this intrinsically means is that no other Bigfoot can gain entry into the cave, unless they're wearing a Bidzil leather bracelet. I guess the red-headed Bigfoot really didn't think Bidzil would be interested in marking me as his own, but he underestimated the kindness and generous compassion of this Bigfoot family, who have taken me cordially under their wings. I was to learn that there are different clans of Bigfoots, often at loggerheads with each other. There are often fights against rival groups, but no one ever dares take on Bidzil. I asked where he'd gone. They said he was scouting other territory, looking for warmer locations for winter. They often move around, as they're like nomads. The Bigfoot female told me that Bitzel means strong. I gather her name is Lamontsi, which means pretty flower. The son that rescued me was called Kitlali, which means star. The daughter was called Bahita, which means eagle child. The young Bigfoots played games with me on the cave floor. I played with them using a thin stick to hit an acorn. The object was to aim the acorn into a little goalpost that's made out of sticks. The game is called Omonsi, and it was not easy. Naturally, I was worried about returning home, as that ghastly red-headed Bigfoot was hell-bent on claiming me as his own. He was hanging around the area like an obnoxious bad smell. I was thrilled when Bitzel finally returned home, with a massive deer flung over his shoulders. He was enormous, 1,000 pounds easily or more, and 10 foot tall. No one in their right mind would ever challenge a creature as titanic as him. He is Herculean in size, built like an army tank. When he entered the cave, he was rather bewildered to see me sitting there playing with Sitali and Bahita, his 2 beloved children, whom I had grown very fond with over the last 3 days. It's then that Lamontsi, the female Bigfoot, begins to talk to him earnestly, backwards and forwards, in a deep, compelling conversation. I know I'm being discussed at great length. Bitzel is the most lofty, majestic, powerful and awesome Bigfoot. So human-looking, rather reminding me of a noble Indian chief. I could easily envisage him wearing one of those Indian headdresses made of eagle's feathers. He looks at me and says to me telepathically, "You will be safe. I will mark you as my own. No one can claim you." He measures my wrist with his hands, prepares me a leather bracelet, the one I'm wearing now. Bitzel throws me over his shoulders. The other Bigfoot seems so sad to see me go. They pat me on the back. I hear them saying in my head, "We will miss you." Tears spring up in my eyes, for I know I will miss them too. Bitzel carries me down the rock face with such grace. The auburn Bigfoot's face glances directly at my hands, which I'm waving for him to see. "Look! I've got one of Bitzel's bracelets!" His face becomes downcast when he sees I'm wearing a Bitzel leather bracelet. He ambles away solemnly, knowing that I now belong to Bitzel, and there's nothing he can do about it. I think he's gutted. Bitzel takes me back to the forest and says to me in my head, "Godspeed, my child. May God be with you." I thanked him for what he'd done. He nodded and glided away. So here I am, back to Victoria. As you can imagine, Layla's story intrigued me. I believed every word of it. The leather bracelet she was wearing on her wrist from Bitzel was actually rather attractive. I fancied one for myself. Layla decided to tell the police that she had no memory of what had happened to her in the woods, and where she'd been. So for us, life returned to normal again. If I have any advice for mothers embarking on raising a baby, please take my mother-in-law's sagacious advice. Be around for your baby on those first few impressionable years, for they grow up far too fast. You would have missed out on so much. I'm so glad I listened to Maggie. There's no question that she was right about that. But I will say this, if you can afford to get help, it'll be a good idea for you, as being a mother is exhausting work. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Sharon Denver was fast asleep when the loud, doggedly determined knocking was heard at the front door of her Buckhead apartment in Atlanta. She leaned towards her bedside lamp to switch it on, and in her just-awake clumsiness, her shaking fingers very nearly dislodged the glass tumbler of water perched on the side table that was rattling precariously from the aftershock of almost taking an unfortunate tumble, where it invariably would have crash-landed on the hardwood floor, breaking into smithereens, which in Sharon's opinion was not a good omen, although her sister Nicolette insisted that breaking glass with water inside it was considered terribly lucky. Through bleary, half-asleep eyes, she begrudgingly glanced at her clock on her nightstand, visibly groaning when she saw the time. It was 2:05 in the morning, for goodness sake. You've got to be joking. The knocking persisted. Whoever
whoever was at the front door did not appear to be going away in a hurry. Who could be knocking at her door at this ungodly hour of the morning, she wondered, feeling a trifle affronted to have her sleep so rudely interrupted, but also rather apprehensive about who it could be knocking on her door at this late hour, and what that knock would ultimately mean. She had been thrown out of her dark, inauspicious nightmare when she'd been dragged down a long, dark alley by her ex-boyfriend Art, who had been pulling her legs and leering at her with a triumphant, gormless grin on his face. "I've got you now. You're not getting away. You can never escape me, Sharon. I'm always here." Perhaps Sharon should have been pleased to have been roused from such an ominous, unsettling dream, but she was not. Ostensibly, even nightmares could be moderately entertaining. After all, they were just movies in the mind that entertained you while you slept. Besides, she knew very well that in real life, her easygoing, fun-loving ex-boyfriend Art imposed absolutely no threat to her at all. Besides, he was already happily dating someone new, and had probably long since forgotten about her, although that thought irked her considerably, as no one likes to feel that they've been forgotten so easily. Grim, dark shadows danced around her bedroom, announcing the late hour, but moments later they were interspersed with flashing blue lights that trespassed across her walls. In that moment, Sharon knew unequivocally that there must be a police car parked in front of the apartment block. The blue lights were revelatory. What were the police doing at her apartment block at this late hour? Had something really bad happened? The knocking sounded again. Sharon eased herself reluctantly out of bed, mumbling disconcertingly to herself under her breath that she was actually coming. I mean, whoever was at the door banging away should have some courteous consideration for people being inconsiderately roused from their sleep in the middle of the night or early hours of the morning like this. When Sharon reached the front door, she peered rather reluctantly through the spy hole, as she knew you could never be too sure who might be on the other side of the door. She'd seen enough insanitary movies in her life of uncongenial strangers at the door that you'd never ever invite in unless you wanted a rendezvous with the Grim Reaper himself. She always remained cautiously vigilant whenever she answered the door at a late hour. "Who is it?" she called, placing her ear against the wood-panelled door. "It's the police," came the voice. "The name is Detective Robert Cox. May I have a quick word with you, ma'am?" Sharon knew that anyone could pretend to be a policeman on the other side of the door in order to cunningly manipulate them their way into the apartment at this late, lonely hour of the night. But it was something about the urgent professional tone of the man's voice, combined with the blue flashing light she'd seen only moments before flashing across her bedroom walls, that Sharon knew that he was speaking the truth. "I can show you some ID, ma'am, if you like," said the voice on the other side of the door. "I don't mind pushing it through your letterbox." "No, it's all right. I believe you," said Sharon. Sharon pulled back the chain of the door, and through the open crack she could see a rather handsome man standing out there, his back as straight as a pencil, his demeanour very professional. Sharon noticed the gentleman was not wearing a police uniform, but plain clothes. He presented to her with his ID. She took it from him through the crack in the door and studied it for a brief second. The word detective grabbed her attention. She unlatched the chain and opened the door, while he stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing, debonair young man, who took up so much space because of his height, so that Sharon could not see what was going on in the corridor outside the door. But she had heard low, earnest voices, and a scuffle of urgent activity in the background. What on earth was going on, she privately wondered. There was no way this apartment block should be so busy at this godless hour of the night. Something was almost certainly happening around her, and whatever it was, Sharon knew instinctively it was not good. "Sorry for waking you, ma'am, at this very late hour. I'm afraid there's been an unfortunate incident in the apartment building. I need to ask you a few questions, if I may."
The good-looking detective studied her through what Sharon would describe as rather fetching hazel green eyes that she found attractive. As Sharon stood in the doorway, she suddenly felt very self-conscious. The detective with his broad shoulders was exactly her type. She knew she probably looked like a scarecrow, with her rather tousled hair flying all over the place, but she couldn't help the mischievous, disobedient behaviour of her untamed hair, that seemed to always have a mind of its own, and enjoyed looking particularly dreadful when a handsome stranger chose to call. Why did that always happen to her, she wondered, that you would look your very worst when a potential suitor appeared on the scene? Didn't they say first impressions were absolutely everything? She began to awkwardly straighten her hair with the back of her hand to tame down the mess of her tumbling curls. She noticed the detective for a brief second appeared to be staring at her pyjamas incredulously. Or had that shocked, rather bewildered look been in her imagination? Sharon could not be sure. Detective Cox was probably quite surprised that someone of Sharon's maturity would be wearing pyjamas covered with pictures of Little Red Riding Hood and the 12 Dwarfs, displayed all over the flannel fabric that was probably only suitable for a 5-year-old to wear. The pyjamas had a story of their own, of course, but the detective did not know that. Sharon's sister Nicolette had made them for her out of some fabric she had used to make her toddler's pyjamas, when Sharon had discovered by mistake that she'd left her pyjamas at home while staying the weekend with Nicolette's family. Nicolette, who was ever resourceful and an excellent seamstress to boot, set to work on her sewing machine, making her sister some snug pyjamas out of the same fabric, and apologized profusely that the flannel was a tad babyish, but it was the only fabric she could find at the time suitable for making warm pyjamas. In the end, the juvenile-looking pyjamas were so incredibly comfortable, Sharon wore them all the time in the privacy of her apartment. In this quintessential moment, she felt herself flushing with self-conscious embarrassment. She folded her arms and looked directly into the detective's eyes. "What kind of incident are you talking about, detective?" The detective took out a notebook and pen.
"First things first. Can I ask you your name, ma'am?"
"Yes, of course you can. My name is Sharon Denver."
"Sharon Denver,"
said the detective, scribbling down her name on his pad and looking up at her through inquiring eyes.
"How long have you lived in this apartment block, Mrs. Denver, or is it Miss?"
he said, his eyes quickly travelling across to her fingers to see if she was wearing a wedding band. "It's Miss Denver, but you can call me Sharon if you like. I've been living here for the last 4 years. I moved in here when I was 22 years old. Everybody keeps themselves to themselves in this apartment block. When I moved here, I thought I'd make friends. But people here are quite elusive, you know, very private, if you know what I mean. I don't even know my neighbours, although I guess we're all familiar with each other's faces and the cars we drive. I share this apartment with my roommate, but she's not here at the minute. She's gone away for the weekend."
"I see," said Detective Cox. "I did get the impression in my inquiries knocking on people's doors that no one appears to know each other around here very well, which is a pity. Your roommate, what is her name, if I may ask?"
"Her name is Freya Warrington."
"So where exactly did Freya go for the weekend?"
"Do you really need to know something like that, detective? I don't see why that should concern you."
"Well, I need to be thorough in my investigation, Miss Denver."
"Well, she went to stay at her parents' farm in North Carolina. From what I've gleaned, she comes from a very close family. I don't actually know her very well. She only moved into this apartment a month ago, you see. So we've not really had a chance to get to know each other better." "Yes, she's always busy, running around, you know, that kind of thing."
"So she's busy, is she?"
"Yes, very busy as it happens. You see, she rushes off to work in the mornings and returns to the apartment reasonably late. I believe she's a graphic designer, but I've never seen anyone that rushed off their feet, if you know what I mean. I get the impression she's terribly ambitious,
But I guess you'd have to be to work the hours she does. She doesn't eat breakfast in the morning or even grab a coffee. She's out of the apartment before I even get up. She returns late in an evening. So we're like passing ships in the night, you could say."
"I see, ma'am. So you're sure she didn't come back to the apartment at any time during the day or night?"
"Absolutely not. She took her weekend bag with her with some casual clothes for the weekend. She did actually tell me this morning that she was not coming back tonight, but going straight home to North Carolina. So that's where she's gone. She'd have taken a short flight home, I believe."
"This overnight bag you're talking about, what did it look like, if you don't mind my asking you?"
"You want to know that? Well, it was pink with some silver bling on the shoulder strap and on the edges of the bag. Why would you ask?" At this, Detective Cox's gaze sharpened.
"You're sure that that was the overnight bag she was carrying?"
"Yes, reasonably sure. It's a pretty distinctive bag. Why do you ask, Detective?"
"And she does this regularly, does she? Go off for the weekend to stay with her parents?"
Sharon nodded. "Yes, like I said. She's close to her parents, but then again, I don't really know her terribly well. I haven't known her long."
"I need to ask you, ma'am, whether you were home all evening, or did you go out at any point? Did you have any friends over to the apartment, perhaps, for a drink or something?" he asked.
Sharon flushed, because for a 26-year-old woman to be stuck in her sorry apartment on a Friday night, on her lonesome, was almost sad, pathetic really. But Sharon had not felt like going out on the town to meet friends for drinks. She had feigned a headache in order to spend an evening by herself, in her little Red Riding Hood pyjamas, with only the 12 dwarfs for company. Sometimes she liked it that way, just to switch off from the rest of the world and disconnect in order to recharge her batteries. Besides, it had knocked her for 6 when she'd heard that her ex-boyfriend Art, who she'd broken up with 3 weeks prior, who claimed to have been devastated by the breakup, was now so easily dating someone new. It had hurt her to the quick to think that she could be so easily replaced. It was a bit of a blow to the ego. She wondered if perhaps she was a little green at the gills concerning the new woman in Art's life. Maybe she had cared more about him than she admitted, but he was certainly on her mind, for he had played the leading role in her nightmare this evening. "No, I was here all evening. I did order a pizza, though. It was a margarita."
"What time did you order your pizza, ma'am?"
"I don't see how that can be remotely important, Detective. It's just a stupid pizza, isn't it?"
"Everything is important, ma'am. There is no such thing as a stupid pizza. I'm partial to them myself, you know."
"It was probably about 7:30 or so." Once again the detective made more notes, which included the name of the pizzeria she'd ordered her takeaway from. Maybe he thought the delivery man might have seen something on his rounds. It seemed as if Detective Robert Cox was very thorough, leaving no stone unturned, even asking her about a roommate that wasn't even around when the incident occurred.
"I want to ask you, ma'am, did you hear anything or see anything unusual over the course of the evening or the early hours of this morning? It's very important. I need you to think about this long and hard. Any strange sounds you might have heard, perhaps, that grabbed your attention?"
Sharon shook her head. "I told you, Detective, I was here all the time. I didn't leave the apartment, and I didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. I did see my next-door neighbour going into her apartment at the time I received my pizza delivery. Her name's Brenda Larkin, I believe. I've kept a parcel for her before, so I remembered her name. I noticed she had grocery bags in her hand, so I guess she'd been out shopping. We nodded at each other in passing, as you do. But as I was saying, I don't know her at all, beyond exchanging a few pleasantries. Are you going to tell me, Detective, what happened tonight? What is this incident about?" Detective Cox did not answer her, but promptly handed her a business card.
"If you can think of anything you might have overlooked, ma'am, could you please give me a call on this number? Any detail can make a world of difference. Believe me, sometimes the most obscure, insignificant details that you may think are completely irrelevant can give us all the answers we're looking for."
Sharon studied the card. "Detective Robert Cox," she said, reading his name out loud.
"That's right," he said, nodding at her. "As I was saying, ma'am, it's very important if you can think of anything. Give me a call."
"Will do so," said Sharon.
"Once again, ma'am, thank you for helping me with my inquiries. I apologize for waking you at such an inconvenient early hour. But sometimes in these kind of scenarios, for a successful outcome, our investigations must begin at once."
"That's all right," said Sharon, closing the door behind her. Sharon's woolly mind, that was a little disorientated when she first got out of bed, was now sharp and alert, dappled with a curious intrigue. What the hell had happened in their apartment block? What on earth was going on? And why was the detective so incredibly evasive, with a dogged refusal to answer her questions? Could he have not at least given her a little clue about what had happened? He had been so quick to brush her inquiry away, as if it was just a few dog hairs on a coat. Did she not deserve to know what was going on in her apartment block? As after all, she lived here, didn't she? She ambled over to her bathroom to cautiously observe her sorry reflection in the mirror, and to reveal to herself the true horror of what she'd looked like when opening the front door to a handsome stranger. Talk about bad timing, with a debonair man like Robert Cox standing in the doorway. She'd have very much liked to have been wearing one of her head-turning dresses, like the blue one she owned with the high neckline, that always made men give her a second glance. She did look a sight for sore eyes this evening, with her hair frolicking wildly over her head in a tangled mess. It didn't help she was wearing such babyish pyjamas. She could only wonder what Detective Robert Cox must have thought of her. That she was whimsical, naive, childlike perhaps. A woman in her early 20s fixated over Little Red Riding Hood. There was a cloying, nasty taste in the back of her mouth, so Sharon brushed her teeth rigorously, returning back to bed with minty fresh breath, feeling restlessly unsettled about the disarming events of the night, so much so it was hard to get back to sleep. The moment she'd been roused from her slumber, when the detective had knocked on the door, and she'd been dragged away from her nightmare, she had felt decidedly off. Perhaps it was the discombobulating thought of her ex-boyfriend Art in another woman's arms. She wondered why this bothered her so very much. Maybe her ego was crushed because he'd been so quick to replace her, like buying a brand new set of trainers after your others have become obsolete. She knew that she had been the one that had walked away from their relationship, but even so she was beginning to feel a few waves of regret about her decision to break up with him. Her life had become so lonely without him, to fill in the lonely gaps. But after seeing Detective Cox at the door this evening, she had felt something between them that she couldn't explain. Or maybe she was hoping she could feel something between them. Maybe she wanted to feel something. That was probably more like it. She was romanticizing about a brief encounter with a very good-looking man, who probably would never give her a second glance. She reluctantly climbed under her duvet, lying under it with her head pressed against the pillow. Her eyes remained wide open. She wondered what it was that Detective Cox was investigating. She thought about the people that lived in this apartment block in Buckhead. She had told Detective Cox she didn't know the people that lived here, and that was true. But in passing she recognized familiar faces. She did recall there was a dodgy-looking character she'd seen coming out of apartment number 36 from time to time. She had not mentioned this fact to Detective Cox, as it might have appeared like indiscriminate character assassination on her part, for she knew you should never judge a book by its cover. Her mother had taught her that lesson when introducing her to a woman who looked like she lived on the streets all her life, because she was so dishevelled and unkempt. Sharon was to later find out she was one of the wealthiest women in Atlanta, living in an illustrious residence, but it was clear the woman paid so little regard to her appearance. She did recall when the dodgy-looking man in question had climbed into the lift with her at the apartment block to get to a higher floor, that she had instinctively clung to her purse as tightly as she could, as she felt it was under threat of being snatched. She had wondered how a man with a stained string vest that looked like it had been worn for several days with something messily spilled down the front that looked ominously like coffee, could live in an upmarket apartment block like this? How could he possibly afford the rent when he couldn't even replace his shirt? Or did he just not care that he looked like an absolute slob? His wild, unkempt, curly brown hair had definitely not seen a barber for over a decade. It looked greasy, as if it had actually been washed in salad dressing. And furthermore, his stale breath smelt like a brewery, intermingled with heavy spices left behind from his last meal. So when he entered the lift, it had made Sharon want to gag, especially the smell of all that excess garlic. Sharon had privately thought that he was likely the type that was anchored to his settee all day long, watching daytime television, smoking spiffs, drinking beers, and ordering a plethora of takeaways, while doing dodgy deals on his phone with people who sold drugs for a living, or something else equally as underhanded and duplicitous. There was something not quite right about him, she thought, and she considered herself a reasonably good judge of character. His rogue dark eyes had been scanning her somewhat licentiously, as though he was thinking to himself that she was a bit of all right, while they stood side by side in the lift, waiting to get to their respective floors. The man's wandering eyes had felt as intrusive as an aeroplane luggage scanner, going right through the fine details of your luggage. He had given her a gormless, cheesy grin and said,
"The name is Red, by the way, as in the colour red. My surname is Redford, you see. Everybody calls me Red. If you want to pop in for a drink another time, you are welcome. Any time you're welcome. I've seen you around the apartment block before. I like to get to know people living around here."
Once again he gave her another big full grin, showing off a set of yellowing teeth that probably had not seen a toothbrush in weeks. He patted his sizable girth and said,
"I make a mean meatloaf, by the way. It's my grandmother's secret recipe. If you're interested, I'm cooking on Tuesday night. Pop in any time, and you can have a lovely helping. It's delicious. You won't be disappointed. You know I'm telling you the truth, 'cause there ain't such a thing as a good skinny cook," he said, letting out a laugh. "Remember, I'm apartment 36. If you get lonely, you know where you can come. You're welcome any time."
"Thanks," she had said, looking down at the carpet of the lift to avoid his intrusive gaze. When he got off to his level, he said,
"Well, I'll see you when I see you,"
he said, walking away, while Sharon visibly sighed with relief when she was now safely alone in the lift, with all but the lingering smell of beer, intermingled with the nauseating spices and garlic. Of course she had never accepted the vague invitation, for there was something sleazily inappropriate about Red that had made her flesh crawl, even though his invitation had seemed genuinely warm. She had seen this Red character hanging around with a couple of seedy friends in the corridor one night when she'd returned home from a bar with friends. The men he was with were clearly inebriated, smoking and drinking in the corridor, making a rowdy noise, and when Red's friends had seen her, they had let out some wolf whistles, but not until now did it occur to her that Red could have invited trouble to their apartment block. Was this the reason, she wondered, why the police were doing an investigation? It wouldn't surprise her at all if Red was up to his ears in trouble. He looked like the type that might have spent a stint in prison. As Sharon's eyes adjusted to the dark shadows that danced rather ominously around her bedroom, they were still impregnated by flickering blue lights of a police car, possibly more than just one, that flashed across her walls. She climbed out of bed and trotted over to the window, pulling back the curtains to study the street below. She realized there was a lot of frenzied activity going on beneath her. There were 3 police vehicles parked in front of the apartment block, along with a white van which she was sure was forensics. I mean, what else could it possibly be? There were people on the street wearing white plastic suits, and she could see that Detective Cox was speaking to a man in earnest. Even though she could not see him personally, she could pick up the solemnness of the occasion. Had someone been murdered? Those were the very thoughts that entered her mind. This had to be a murder. What else could it be? No other event, she thought, would create so much fuss at this late hour. Sharon pulled a blanket out of her closet to wrap around her shoulders, to keep her warm as she continued watching the curious activity going on beneath her feet. The people rushing around backwards and forwards, the serious looks on people's faces. It was the kind of sobering scene she had seen in the movies and on the news, but here on the front street of the Buckhead apartment seemed more than a little bizarre. Moments later her worst fears were confirmed, when a gurney on wheels was pulled out of the building with a sheet covering a long lump, and it was being placed in the back of a coroner's van. It must be a body, she thought. Detective Cox was standing with the man that Sharon guessed must be the coroner, and there was a lot of nodding and shaking of heads going on, as they engaged in serious conversation together. Detective Cox was taking down yet more notes, rather vigorously in his black notepad, like he had done with her earlier on in the evening. Seeing this unfortunate conundrum unfold before her eyes, like a scene in the movies, made Sharon suddenly feel incredibly isolated and alone. She wanted to call her father at once and tell him what was going on outside her apartment block, but she was not sure how her call would be received. She tried to convince herself that her dad would be cool if she woke him up at 4 o'clock in the morning, but on reflection, if she phoned him up at this time, he'd probably think she'd been involved in a near-fatal car accident and be freaking out, while her paranoid, overwrought mother would be clucking like a mother hen, getting her knickers in a twist about absolutely everything and nothing. You only had to say the word murder to her mother, and Sharon knew her days staying at the apartment block here in Buckhead would be numbered. Furthermore, if she told them about what was going on beneath her window, her helicopter parents would whisk her away from her independent life faster than you could say Albert Einstein. She could almost imagine her mother shaking her soft head of peroxide blonde curls and saying, "The world is such a dreadful, dreadful place, Sharon. In my day it was safe to walk down the street, you know, to let your kids play out of doors. We did it all the time when I was growing up, and my parents never blinked an eyelash. It was safer back then, so much safer, but now things have changed exponentially. If there's been a murder in your apartment block, it proves what me and your father have been saying all along. It's not safe for you to live on your own, Sharon, until you're married. Please move in with us, love. You know it makes sense." Sharon could visualize the interchange of their conversations that would reach a stalemate, as Sharon was as obstinate as her mother was at times, but at the end of the day her mother most often masterfully got the upper hand with her persuasive arguments. If she phoned her parents right now, they would be at her apartment within 10 minutes flat, as the family semi-detached house was only 10 minutes away. And when they got to Sharon's apartment, she was in no doubt that they would begin flapping around like a couple of flustered pigeons, panicking over everything. She knew calling them would be sealing her own fate, and her independence would drop out of her life like a bird dropping on a windscreen window. She could envision them nagging her to come home over and over again, and at 26 she valued her newfound independence. She wondered if there was anybody else she could possibly call right now, but no name came to mind, and even her older sister Nicolette would certainly not appreciate a call at this time of the morning, as with the demands of raising 2 little toddlers, her sister was permanently exhausted and valued sleep as if it was as precious as the crown jewels. Sharon knew phone calls could scare the living daylights out of people at this late hour, but the inauspicious events of the night had disquieted her considerably, and she wanted to share her troubled thoughts with someone, to ease her somewhat befuddled mind. But there appeared to be no one she could talk to. It was so discomposing and creepy to be watching people beneath her feet, moving to and fro, many still wearing plastic suits. Somehow sharing her feelings with a friend would probably have made her feel more grounded, and the events of the evening seem a lot less daunting. Someone had been murdered in this apartment block. Well, that's what she couldn't help but conclude. So would she ever feel safe again? She wondered as an ominous picture of Red's face flashed into her mind. Was he behind these current inauspicious events, she wondered? When people rented apartments here, even if they were reasonably well off? Were they properly vetted to check that they had no criminal records and stuff like that? Because Sharon was sure that if they were vetted, then this sort of thing would never happen. Because Sharon knew with a conviction that someone had died this evening in less than favourable circumstances, and the manner of their death had to be suspicious. She had seen it all, the body being taken into the gurney of a coroner's van. Something had gone on this night. I'm going to have a long hot soak in the bath, she told herself, as I'm never going to get any sleep now. I might as well wake up and get my day started. Although being a Saturday morning, there was nothing pressing that would need her immediate attention. She could take a walk downstairs later, and a trip to the delicatessens to buy cold meats and bread for lunch. And while she was out and about on the street, she'd sniff around for any snippets of information as to what might have occurred in her apartment block in the early hours of the morning, as surely someone must know something. She ambled over to the bath and tested the temperature of the water, and fully satisfied that she wasn't going to boil in the water like a lobster, she began to fill up the bath. She sprinkled in some aromatic bath salts, a mix of patchouli, bergamot, and clary sage. She disrobed, lowered herself into the bath, and lay luxuriantly, rather indulgently in the warm water for a long time, soaking in the relaxing scents and enjoying the steam, while closing her eyes as tightly as she could, willing away the haunting images of that recently deceased corpse she had just seen, wheeled on a gurney into a coroner's van. Maybe getting into the bath was a subconscious way of washing away the disquieting event. But if that had been her whimsical, naive belief, she was to be disappointed, for the disconcerted imagery of those men dressed in white kept clawing back rudely into her mind. They were obviously a forensic team, scanning for evidence, trying to look for clues as to who had perpetrated this dreadful atrocity. Sharon could only wonder who the victim of this horrible, wretched crime was, and why anyone would choose to murder this poor person. No one deserved this, surely. Sharon climbed out of the tepid bath water, patting her feet dry on the bathroom mat, and drying her whole body with a soft towel. She sashayed over to her bedroom closet to decide what it was she wanted to wear. For a long while she stood there rather absent-mindedly, with her towel still wrapped around herself, staring vacantly at the clothes in her wardrobe, almost as if her mind was 1,000 miles away. Normally such a basically simplistic decision would have been so easy to make, as choosing what to wear always came easily to Sharon. This morning her whirling mind was indecisively caught up in a blur of disorientated confusion. She thought of what had occurred downstairs, and her focus seemed to have been flung out of the window. In the end Sharon settled for a simple pair of black leggings and a loose-fitting pink sweater, with a logo on it saying, "You go, girl." It had been given to her as a present from her sister, and was one of the most comfortable sweaters she actually owned, as it was so big and cosy, and right now big, comfy clothes made her feel cushioned in security. She padded to the kitchen, ferreting around in the freezer, pulling out a brown paper bag, where she selected a couple of frozen croissants and put them on a warming tray, which she placed in the oven, until the whole kitchen smelt toasty and delicious. Soon she was at the counter sipping warm coffee and tucking into her favourite almond-flavoured croissants, drenched in butter and jam. The sweetness of the jam seemed to soothe the rattling thoughts inside her that were becoming increasingly noisy. She put on the radio, hoping that some local news might be able to shed light on what had happened here at her Buckhead apartment block. But there was nothing to be heard, apart from a cacophony of musical hits being played over the radio, and a local report on a bridal expo, where the organizer was encouraging even people who were not getting married to come along for the ride. "If you've got nothing better to do on a Saturday morning, bring the family along, why don't you? It'll be a wonderful day out for you all. The tickets are inexpensive, and there is so much to do and see." Sharon did not like the idea of looking at bridal gowns when she was far beyond getting married herself. She had broken away from a 5-year relationship with Art and had lost any interest in returning to a life of perennial dating. She knew online dating was not what it was cracked up to be, and half the liaisons were more about one-night stands rather than enduring, meaningful and long-lasting relationships. And at this stage of her life she abhorred anything insincere and shallow. How some people could go out with a stranger for a night of passion, to never see them again, was something that made no sense to her at all. Before the events of last night, she had planned her Saturday out really well. She had intended to go shopping in the morning for a dress to wear at a girlfriend's wedding in 6 weeks' time. Then she was going to meet up with her friend Lara for lunch. But now it felt all wrong to be doing any of that. Even popping out to a delicatessens seemed wrong. But she reminded herself that life did not stop just because someone had died. You still had to eat, shop, work, continue with your daily activities, almost as if nothing had happened at all. Every day people died, did they not? But the world still revolved around its axis, and people continued with the normal routines of their daily lives. And that is what she would have to do. She began to sift through the messages on her cell phone, and noticed that there was one from her roommate Freya Warrington. It was the most recent message that she had received at 10 p.m. the previous evening, a voice message that she had happened to overlook. Hi, is that you? Sorry, Sharon, it's me, Freya Warrington. Just to let you know, don't get a shock if you hear a noise. I'm coming back to the apartment this evening. It'll probably be after 10. I'm returning to the flat, I'm afraid. I decided not to go home after all for the weekend. I've just got too many things to do at the moment. Maybe we could do something together over the weekend. I'm free on Sunday. It would be good to get to know you better, Sharon. I know a place that does a really mean Sunday lunch. Goodness gracious me, thought Sharon, suddenly realizing that her roommate Freya Warrington must have turned up last night after all, without her knowing, and was probably fast asleep in her bedroom right now. Freya must be a very deep sleeper, she thought. She must have been dead to the world, to have not heard the knock at the front door from Detective Cox. How could anybody sleep through that, she wondered. Sharon had not taken any precautions to be terribly quiet the previous night, having automatically assumed her roommate was far away in North Carolina, enjoying time with family. Yet she had not heard a dicky bird out of the girl. Should she check in on her to see that she was all right? Maybe she had made plans and gone off somewhere else, or maybe she was still fast asleep in her bed. You did hear of people who could sleep through tornadoes and raging storms and wake up in the morning knowing nothing about it. Maybe she was like that. As she was thinking about this, there came another knock at her front door. It was Detective Robert Cox at the door again, but this time the tension in his shoulders and the tightness in his clenched jaw were very discernible. The detective's back was as straight as a pencil, his posture rigid, the tone of his voice authoritative.
I'm very sorry to disturb you once again, ma'am.
Please call me Sharon. It's no problem, Detective. I was up and about anyway.
I wanted to talk to you about your roommate, Freya Warrington, if I may.
Oh, about that, said Sharon, quickly passing her cell phone over to the detective. I'm afraid my roommate, she didn't go back home to North Carolina after all. In fact, she's just left me this message. I thought she was staying with her parents, but she's been here at the flat all the time.
She didn't? Asked the detective, raising a brow. So she's here then. You've seen her for yourself, have you?
No, I haven't seen her in person, Detective. She must have returned home last night, rather late, so I missed her, I suspect. But it's on my cell phone. Her message, I mean. She left it after 10 p.m., saying she was returning to the apartment. But with all the noise that's been going on, I wonder why she never got up. I was about to check on her when you knocked on the door. Detective Cox looked intrigued. He studied the message on Sharon's cell phone.
You've only read this now, have you, ma'am? Freya Warrington left you this message at 10:05 in the evening last night.
Sharon nodded.
Did you hear her return home last night, perhaps? Did you not hear a key in the lock?
No, I didn't. But then I never hear her, Detective. She's very considerate like that, unlike anybody else that has shared a flat with me. I actually never know when she's in or not.
Well, do you think, ma'am, you can go and wake her up for me? It's very important for me to confirm her presence in this flat of yours.
There was something about the detective's earnest yet solemn tone of voice and the look on his face that made Sharon pause for breath. Why this sudden interest in her roommate? Something about this cross-examination felt exceedingly off, and she began to wonder about her roommate's safety. Was she all right? Had something bad happened to her? Please God, no. Sharon quickly hurried over to Freya's bedroom door, her legs now wobbling awkwardly beneath her, her heart almost flouncing in her chest. She gingerly knocked on the bedroom door. And with a cracked voice she said, Freya, it's me, Sharon. Sorry to disturb you. There's a detective at the door. He wants to actually speak to you. He wants to establish that you're here. Sharon knew there would be no answer, and no answer came. She knocked again. Freya, it's me, Sharon. It's me, Sharon. It's important you answer the door. But there was no response. So reluctantly, she opened the door, a fiery heat rising from the pit of her belly, up her arms and her neck and face. At first the creaking door seemed to put up a little resistance. It was a heavy-built door, but soon the hulking presence of Detective Cox was reassuringly by her side. He took charge, pushing the heavy door open with a forceful jerk, and it obediently swung open on its hinges. The room was empty. Freya's bed was neatly made. There was a beautiful brightly coloured comforter spread across the bed, with a tapestry cushion against her puffed-up pillows that read, Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bugs bite. There were a few of her clothes she'd worn during the week lying sprawled over a laundry basket, and a top-of-the-range laptop computer opened out onto the desk, and beneath the desk was a wire dustbin, filled to the brim with crumpled pieces of paper. On Freya's nightstand was a framed picture of her with her family. They were all smiling widely into the camera lens, against an idyllic backdrop of trees. They were sporting glasses of champagne in their hands, as if celebrating a special event. Detective Cox walked over to the picture, picked it up in his hands, and studied it closely. He tapped a figure on the picture and showed it to Sharon.
Is this your roommate?
He asked her. Sharon studied the photograph and nodded, while Detective Cox physically stiffened. Everything about Freya's room was well ordered and neat. The room felt fresh and clean, but Sharon did not get the sense that Freya had been in the room for a long while. It was almost as if she knew that her roommate had not returned home to the apartment last night. Her stomach lurched. She suddenly felt quite queasy, as if the croissants she had recently ingested were threatening to make another less glamorous reappearance, and she didn't want this to happen in front of this very attractive-looking detective. She turned around to look at Detective Cox straight in the face. She wanted answers, and this man was not going to fob her off this time. I don't understand it. Freya was supposed to come back last night, after she messaged me. You saw the message yourself. Why is she not here? Unless she left the apartment very early, and I never heard her leave. She's very discreet, you see, she said, her voice trailing off into a silent whisper, as of course Sharon knew that that was just wishful thinking on her part. The detective was silent for a brief moment, and said nothing. Then Sharon impulsively burst out. It's her, isn't it, Detective Cox? You found a body. It's my roommate. Please don't fob me off. I'm not stupid. I saw a body on a gurney being put into a white forensic van last night from my bedroom window. So I know we're dealing with a dead body here, aren't we, Detective? It's not Freya, is it?
We have found a body, I'm afraid, said Detective Cox, looking at Sharon empathetically. I believe it was your roommate, Freya Warrington.
Oh, no! Oh, no! That's terrible! She's dead! She's dead!
I'm afraid so. I'm very sorry about this disheartening news. I am very sorry for your loss, ma'am. We did find her pink bag in the corridor. It was not located close to the body, so we weren't sure in the beginning if it actually belonged to the deceased or not. The purse and the bag confirmed the identification of the pink overnight bag as belonging to Freya Warrington. Now that you have shown me her photograph, it affirms to me that the woman we found slumped in the corridor was indeed your roommate.
Oh no! Oh no! That is just awful! I can't believe that, Detective! That's just terrible!
One of the residents, a man called Red, found her propped up against the wall, lying in a crumpled heap. He said he thought she was drunk and inebriated, and had passed out in the corridor. He tried to wake her up to help her to return to the apartment, but that was when he saw the ligature marks around her neck. He knew she'd been strangled. I'm very sorry to be the bearer of such bad news. I can't imagine what it must be like to hear this. It can't be easy for you.
Oh, she's been strangled. She was strangled.
I'm afraid so, ma'am.
You say Red found her? Asked Sharon. I have met that man. There's something about him, Detective, that I don't like. You don't think he did this to her, do you? I mean, he was the one that found the body. Don't they say you should always be suspicious of the first person who finds a dead body? That's what I've heard.
At this point, ma'am, we have no leads, but obviously we are investigating him, as he was the first person to find her. But we are not accusing anyone of this incident until our evidence points to a perpetrator.
But why her?
Asked Sharon, her face crumpling up into sadness, her throat suddenly feeling dry.
I just don't understand. Why would anybody want to hurt her? She seemed like such a nice person. I didn't know her terribly well, but nobody deserves this, Detective. This is absolutely insane. And to think it happened here in our apartment block. And the person who's living with me is now dead. I can hardly believe this. I've always felt incredibly safe living here. Until, of course, I bumped into that Red character in the lift. I thought he was rather dodgy. But beyond that, nothing untoward ever really happens here. People keep themselves to themselves. The place is quiet, unless Red brings along friends over to his apartment. They can be rather rowdy.
Well, that's the way it is with many crimes, ma'am. They sometimes occur in the most unlikely of places.
You're telling me, Detective? I'd have never imagined this happening here. I hope I'll be able to sleep after this.
Is there anything you can tell me, Sharon, about your roommate Freya Warrington? Anything that may be of interest? Has she had anyone visiting her here at the apartment? Or spoken to you perhaps about any boyfriend troubles? Is there anything you can tell me to shed light over this dreadful incident, perhaps?
Sharon shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly.
I told you, Detective Cox. Freya kept herself to herself. I don't even know if she had a boyfriend, or if there was trouble in paradise. She didn't share anything with me. I mean, we had a brief conversation once when she first moved in. And when I interviewed her, as I wouldn't just accept any roommate, as you can appreciate, I always insist on references and that kind of thing, because you can never be too careful.
So you must have spoken to her at length when you were interviewing her, at least.
Well, not really, Detective. I don't know how to put it to you, but I think Freya was a very private person. Even when I talked to her, she was not terribly forthcoming. She's the type of person you'd probably have to know for many years before you got anything out of her. Even before my interview with her, I checked up her references, and no one had a bad word to say about her. So I was reasonably confident before she came over, even for the interview, that she'd likely be a suitable roommate.
So when did she move into your apartment, Sharon?
It was a month ago, Detective, not terribly long. My last roommate left because she was getting married. Her fiancé had rented a flat for them downtown. I was naturally sad to see her go because we were very good friends. But she was considerably older than I was, and was very eager to settle down. I needed to get a replacement as soon as I could, because I was hard-pressed to manage the rent on my own, as I'm afraid my savings are a little bleak, and I didn't want to ask the parents. The apartments here aren't cheap to rent, you see. My dad contributes to my rent every month, or I'd have to live somewhere else a lot less upmarket. I learnt about Freya looking for a place from a friend of a friend. It seemed to be a win-win situation, Detective. Referrals like that are gold dust, you see.
I imagine they are.
Well, when she came to see me, I liked her a lot. I instinctively knew I could trust her, and that's all I cared about. You see, I had a roommate once who pilferaged money from my purse. I thought I was losing my mind because my money kept vanishing. But I caught her stealing from me one day, rifling through my purse. So I kicked her out at once. You can't be too careful, Detective Cox, about the people you let into your apartment.
So what did Freya tell you about herself?
Well, let's see, said Sharon, trying to think back to the day that Freya had arrived at her doorstep, wearing jeans and a sweater, and looking at her through brown, frightened eyes, rather like a deer caught in headlights. Well, that's what she'd thought at the time. I do remember, Detective, that she was on edge at that interview, said Sharon. But I put it down to her, you know, being anxious about it. She was eager to move in, you see, very eager, and was hoping I'd say yes. I thought she was reticently demure by nature, the type of person who likes to shrink in the background and hope you will never notice them, if you know what I mean. She told me she urgently needed to move in right away. She was a graphic designer, and she told me she wouldn't be any trouble at all. She was neat and tidy, and would be out a lot due to the demands of her job. I do know she was eager to move in, and when I gave her the green light within the hour, she arrived at the apartment with all her suitcases in the middle of the day. I do remember she looked somewhat flustered and relieved at the same time, as if a huge weight had been lifted off her shoulders. But I guess finding a roof over your head kind of does that to you. No one wants to be homeless, do they?
But where had she been living before? Do you know?
Oh, she said her living arrangements weren't working out for her. She said she wasn't getting along with her roommate, and then seemed to shut down, as if she'd said too much to me. I suspected she thought I'd be put off by her, if she was having issues with someone else, that I might think that I'd have issues with her as well. She didn't want me to think that she might be a difficult tenant, I suspect.
Did she tell you anything about her life in North Carolina?
Well, she told me she was a country girl. She'd grown up in the countryside, surrounded by the natural world. I think she said her father was in building construction. She loved her life in the countryside. They had horses, chickens and dogs, and at one stage her parents owned a pot-bellied pig called Podge, which was with the family for many years. She said he was the best garbage disposal you've ever seen. They loved him so much he was terribly affectionate. He grew enormous, and when he died the family was absolutely devastated. She told me they had a funeral for him, because that's how much he meant to them.
I've always rather fancied owning a pot-bellied pig myself, chuckled the detective. Got very good personalities, they have, and they're incredibly clean.
I have heard that somewhere.
Well, go on, will you?
She told me she was very close to her parents and her brother Stuart, who was a little older than she is. She loved living in the countryside, but her job had forced her to come to the city. But she liked to go home to be with her family as often as she could. She did think that city life was not really for her, but she was reasonably ambitious and needed to advance her career, so it was important for her to be based here.
You see, you do know something about her, said Detective Cox, looking reasonably pleased, as he began to scribble down notes in his black book. People often know a lot more than they think they do. You've told me quite a lot, ma'am.
Sharon! The name's Sharon. Don't call me ma'am.
This other place she was renting. Do you know where it was, Sharon?
I'm sorry, Detective, I don't. I never asked her about it, but I'm sure it was closed.
Why do you say that?
Well, after the interview, I told her she could move in straight away, didn't I? And then within 20 minutes flat, and maybe even before that, she was here at the apartment with all her suitcases. I remember thinking she was an eager beaver, and I thought she couldn't have come from very far.
I see. You think she was trying to get away from this flatmate of hers?
Well, I don't know, Detective, but I do know her arrangement with him was not working out.
Him? You said she was sharing an apartment with a man?"
said Detective Cox, raising a brow. He appeared to have grown increasingly interested. "Oh, didn't I say? Yes, he was a man. I think she said his name was, what was it? I'm just trying to think now. Barry Baldwin. Yes, that's right, Barry Baldwin it was. She said she was sharing a flat with this man, and she thought it was a bad idea because things had got out of hand. Yes, those were the words she used. She said things had got out of hand." Detective Cox scribbled down some more notes and looked up at Sharon.
"Well, you've given me some good leads, Sharon. I appreciate that. I do need to speak to this Barry Baldwin character and find out what went wrong with his living arrangements when Freya was flat sharing with him."
"You don't think he had something to do with this, do you, Detective? I mean, her being strangled?"
The detective sighed. "With any investigation, you can be grasping at straws. But in the end, we will find out who did this to her. You can be assured of that."
"Are you sure you'll find the person who is responsible for this, Detective? It's just I've seen real-life crime dramas on television of unsolved cases that for years after, they never find the perpetrator."
"I do not believe that that is going to happen in this scenario. I am pretty sure," said Detective Cox assertively, "that we shall find the perpetrator to this crime. I'm also confident that we found your roommate after you showed me her photograph. But I'm sure you can fully appreciate, Sharon, we do need a formal identification from you to affirm that the deceased is indeed your roommate."
"Of course, Detective. I'll do anything I can to help," said Sharon, feeling decidedly sick at the very idea of identifying Freya Warrington, who had only lived with her for a month. But an identification would be needed, and she would do all she could to help in the circumstances, especially with the police investigation, so that Freya's killer could be found and brought to justice. It would seem another discomposing thought was now trespassing in her mind, as she kept thinking about Red, the thuggish-looking character she'd met in the lift, wearing a string vest covered in coffee stains. She had never forgotten the amorous way he had looked at her. There were no words to describe that intrusive look that he had given her, as if he was physically undressing her in his mind. If anyone had anything to do with Freya's death, she wouldn't be remotely surprised if it was him. If she was walking across a lonely street and encountered Red along the way, she would walk to the other side without question, because she'd be afraid he would mean her harm. "Look, Detective Cox, I don't know how to say this to you, but I think Red might have something to do with Freya's death. The more I think about it, the more likely it seems."
"You do?" asked Detective Cox, his jaw tightening. "What makes you say this?"
"Well, yes, there's something about him, Detective Cox, that I don't like. He's, very grubby looking. He's a sleazebag. He gives me the creeps. He really does." The detective's lips began to twitch, as if he was trying to stop himself from smiling.
"I get that a lot in my business, Sharon, I'm afraid. Just so you know, just because someone might look like they're capable of murder, does not mean they are. Looks can be very deceptive. I find that all the time. I will contact you in regards to the ID of Freya Warrington. I will also be in touch shortly. Also, just so you know, I will be sending police officers around to look through Freya's room to see if we can find any clues regarding who might have wished to cause her harm."
"Of course," Sharon had said. "You can come any time you like. I want to help in any way I can. I'm not a suspect, am I, Detective?"
"Everyone connected to Freya Warrington is a suspect. But you can take it from me, Sharon, that I think it's unlikely you had anything to do with your roommate's death."
"Well, Detective, I don't know whether to be relieved or not," she said jokingly. 1 month later, Sharon had been somewhat startled by the phone call she'd received from Mrs. Warrington, who was speaking to her as if in some way she believed that Sharon had been a very close friend to her daughter Freya. Sharon would like to have corrected the woman and assured her that she had not known her daughter terribly well. But it did not seem like the right thing to say to a mother overwrought from grief, who was in need of as much comfort as she could possibly get.
"Oh, it's so good to finally speak to you, Sharon," said Mrs. Warrington. "My daughter told me all about you, you know. Of course, I didn't know your name at the time, but I do now. I'm so glad to be finally talking to someone who knew my daughter so well. She was quite the reticent character, wasn't she? But a kind of person you could never ever hope to meet. Our hearts feel so empty without her bright, cheery face around. She was the light of our lives, you know. I'm sure she was, Mrs. Warrington. Well, it goes without saying, her loss has really devastated us all. I couldn't bear it when she came up to work and live in the city. But you know how it is. Your kids cannot be tied to your apron strings forever, can they? Of course not, Mrs. Warrington. None of this was ever your fault. Well, you know, sometimes I wonder about that, dear. You see, I never had a good feeling about her leaving home. I tried to imagine her getting married one day, and I never could visualize it in my mind's eye, however hard I tried, and that troubled me greatly. It was like deep down in my gut, Sharon. I knew something bad was going to happen to my daughter, and that she would prematurely be taken from us. I even told my husband about my disconcerting feelings, and he told me I was being desperately silly. But the feeling never ever went away, you know. Maybe it's a mother's intuition. Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea. Well, I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. When she told me she was moving in with you, she described you to us as being a very dear friend of hers. Well, let's just say it put my mind at ease. She never wanted to go to the city, you know, but she was so ambitious. So what could she do but chase after her dreams, and we needed to encourage her in that regard. She seemed to be loving her job. But what happened to her downstairs in your apartment block boggles my mind, and for the life of me, I can't understand. Who would do such a vindictive thing to my beautiful little girl? Sharon could hear Mrs. Warrington sniffle and loudly blow her nose in a tissue. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Warrington. So sorry about your loss. I mean, there are no words, are there? Thank you so much, Sharon. That's very kind of you, said Mrs. Warrington, who was obviously suppressing sobs down the phone. You do know the funeral was on hold for a whole month, due to the police investigation, and of course the coroner's report. But we're having the funeral next weekend, I'm glad to say. It's going to be quite serene as an event. Close friends and family, that sort of thing. Our Freya was a very private person, and we need to honour that. She'd have abhorred a big send-off of any kind. I'd love you to come along, as you were such a dear friend of hers, Sharon. I was wondering if I could ask you a very big favour. I hope I'm not being presumptuous. But of course, Mrs. Warrington, I'd like to do anything I can to help. It's Fanny, dear. You don't need to call me Mrs. Warrington. A friend of my daughter's is a friend of mine for life, and I look forward to finally meeting you. The whole family are eager in making your acquaintance. That's kind of you to say, Fanny. Well, what can I do to help? I wondered if you could pack up all Freya's things for me in a couple of suitcases and bring them along to North Carolina with you when you come up for the funeral. And I insist you stay over with us that weekend. It'll be the quintessential opportunity to get to know you better. We will pay all your travel both ways, of course, and the baggage costs for your flight. Do you think you can do that? Or if you choose to come up by car, which is an under 6-hour drive, we will cover petrol and rest stops for you along the way. I probably should have come up to your apartment myself in Atlanta, sorted her room out. But I just haven't got the energy to do it, I'm afraid. I just can't look through my daughter's stuff. It would break my heart. I'm emotionally spent. Anything that reminds me of Freya has me breaking out into tears. Beyond that, I don't want to see where she died. That would be just too distressing for words. But of course, Fanny, I completely understand, and I'm more than happy to help. I'll pack all her stuff up in suitcases and bring it up myself to North Carolina for the funeral. I think I'll come up by car. The drive is not that daunting. It's easier to carry stuff that way in the trunk, if you know what I mean.
than having to fuss about the weight of your stuff on those local flights. They can be quite pedantic, I find. Oh, you are such a sweetheart, Sharon. Why am I not surprised you'd be willing to help? No wonder my daughter shared an apartment with you. You were a terribly good friend to her. Sharon knew she should say something, but how could she? From what she'd gleaned, Freya had probably pretended to her family that she was moving in with a very good friend when she came up to Atlanta, so that she would get her parents off her back and stop them worrying about her so much. Young people did that all the time to ease their parents' worry, by saying things like, "Yes, I know the person I'm sharing a flat with, and one of them loves to cook, so I'll be eating well." That kind of thing. Sharon had seen it before, and had told a few white lies herself to her parents at times, given her mother was such a huge worrier, and was always panicking about whether Sharon was taking care of herself, living on her own. It was clear the Warringtons were protective over Freya, and she had probably believed a few white lies would allay their fears. The last thing Sharon wanted to do was to tell a grieving mother, "No, I wasn't close to your daughter, and no, I don't actually believe she had any close friends. Or I think Freya said this to you, so you wouldn't worry about her." You can't say those kind of things to a grieving mother. It would be a cruel thing to do. Even though Sharon had not known Freya long, she was still melancholic about her loss, and if she needed to play the part that they were close, then that's what she would invariably do. For Freya's sake, of course. Sharon regretted that on the month that Freya had moved in with her, that she had not found out more about her rather reticent roommate. Sharon could not help but think that Freya Warrington was probably running away from her previous roommate, Barry Baldwin. Could he possibly have had something to do with her fortuitous demise? Or was that red character in some way responsible? The man she'd met in the lift who had so conveniently discovered Freya's dead body downstairs in the lobby. Was he responsible for her death? She hoped the police were hot on the trail of the perpetrator, but she wasn't so sure they were, as she thought she would have heard something by now. There would have been a report surely about it on the local news, but she'd heard absolutely nothing. The police, of course, had turned up at her apartment and done a search through all of Freya's things, confiscating her laptop computer from the apartment, and a few other things besides. Sharon had not heard anything from the handsome Detective Cox, and doubted she ever would, which made her feel rather regretful. It was funny, but after she'd met him, her feelings towards her ex-boyfriend Art completely dissipated. There had been something between Sharon and the rather debonair detective after they'd met. A small spark, perhaps. Or was it in her wild, fanciful imagination? "Don't be ridiculous, Sharon," she told herself abruptly. "Why would a man such as Detective Cox want anything to do with someone who wears Red Riding Hood pyjamas? What must he have thought of her? Besides, if he really was interested in you," she told herself firmly, "he might have dropped over to the apartment as an excuse to ask her yet more questions about her roommate. But everything had been very quiet on that front. For all Sharon knew, Detective Cox could be married with a kid, or at the very least in a serious relationship. She decided a man like him, a very handsome one at that, who was definitely a catch, would never need to go on a dating site. He probably had women falling at his feet, begging him for his attention. The thought made her feel rather queasy to the stomach, as she visualized in her mind's eye women throwing their knickers at him, like they do at a rock concert when they fancy the people on stage. "Get a grip," she told herself. "You don't even know the man, and he's making you drool like a dog over a bone. Don't be so ridiculous, it's pathetic. Besides, Detective Cox is definitely not interested in you. What the hell is wrong with you, Sharon?" she reprimanded herself rather severely. Sharon entered Freya Warrington's bedroom with a vacillating hesitancy, pushing open the heavy-weight door ever so slightly, and peering curiously through the crack, almost as if she half expected to see her roommate sitting on the bed, beckoning for her to come in. She pushed the door with a large jerk. It creaked on its hinges and finally opened. She hadn't entered Freya's bedroom since the police had gone through her stuff with a fine tooth comb. Nor had she put up an advertisement for a replacement roommate. As the Warringtons had insisted, the 6 months' rent her daughter had paid her in advance she was to keep. So she was in no hurry to get a new roommate, as it seemed wildly inappropriate in the circumstances. Freya's room looked exactly as she remembered it, but there was a sad emptiness to the space, as if the former occupant of the room was long gone, and even the sweet fragrance of her memory had been erased, which was true, of course, and that made Sharon feel rather downcast. Such a dreadful waste of a young life, she could not help but think, thrown away for no good reason at all. It really wasn't fair. She stoically walked over to Freya's closet and stretched out her arm, pulling off 2 large suitcases lying on top of the closet, covered with all kinds of stickers and slogans. They descended to the floor with a mighty crash. She placed one of the suitcases on the bed and began to fill it up with all Freya's colour-coordinated clothes and shoes, all so neatly organised in her wardrobe. Sharon wondered how anyone could be this fastidiously neat. She wished she'd have had the motivation to colour-code her clothes like this. Sharon was heartily relieved that packing up Freya's things was pretty straightforward. A rather easy job. Freya didn't appear to have a lot of stuff, which meant her car trunk would not be heavily laden with luggage on her trip to North Carolina. It seemed so invasively intrusive to go through a dead person's things, as if she was exploiting Freya's privacy. But this was a job that needed to be done, and in the circumstances she was probably the best person to do it. She had not known Freya terribly well, but against all the odds since her roommate's fortuitous death, she felt a great deal closer to the young lady. It would seem people in the apartment had become very nervous about what had happened over the weekend Freya Warrington tragically lost her life. It was, of course, the single woman in the apartment block who were particularly nervous, fearing that what had happened to Freya Warrington was not a once-off event, and something like that could potentially happen to them, as people do tend to personalise things. Ostensibly some female residents had given notice on their apartments and moved away, believing there was a predator lurking in their midst, and that they could potentially be next on the chopping block, like Sharon's immediate next-door neighbour, Brenda Larkin, who moved out days after she learnt the discomposing news about the deceased corpse lying down in the corridor with ligature marks around her neck. The woman who Sharon had never spoken to much since she'd moved in next door had chosen to have a brief chat with her. "I'm leaving this place," she told Sharon. "You would be wise to do exactly the same as me. There could be a serial killer on the loose, living in these apartments among us, lurking in the shadows, to see who else he can take down. I don't feel safe living here any more. Not after what happened downstairs, let me tell you." "That's understandable," Sharon had said. "As single women we are more vulnerable. Do you think Red had anything to do with this? Do you know who I'm talking about? He lives in apartment 36. "Red!" laughed the woman. "Definitely not him. I know he looks a little thuggish, but he's harmless, really. He's got some dodgy-looking friends, let me tell you. That I will agree. Oh, yes, I've seen some of his friends getting drunk in the corridor, and rather rowdy. Red found the body, you know." "I know," said Brenda Larkin. "But whoever killed Freya, well, they have to be sick in the head, don't they? And I'll put money on it that it wasn't Red. I know he doesn't give off the best vibes, and he's rather sloppy, but he wouldn't do this. There's someone living among us, I'm telling you. They killed that poor girl. Do you know she was strangled with an electric cord, I believe? I mean, who does that? It's sickening, absolutely sickening. All I can say is thank God she wasn't sexually assaulted. It could have been a lot worse, but someone wanted to hurt her." "No, I didn't know she was strangled with an electric cord. That's news to me. Although I did know she was strangled," Sharon admitted. "I had to identify the body myself, you know." "You did?" asked Brenda, pulling a sympathetic face. "Of course you did. You'd have had to do that, wouldn't you? Given you knew her, didn't you? I saw her a few times going into your apartment. She seemed so nice. I don't envy you. I heard she was your roommate. Even so, it can't be easy identifying a body of someone who's been murdered. It wasn't too bad. My roommate looked as if she was just sleeping, that's all. I hope you don't mind me giving you some seasoned advice, but if you know what's good for you, you'll do what I'm doing and give your notice in to your landlord. I'm telling you right now, there's a predator among us, and as single woman, I don't think it's safe for us to live here anymore. Once something like this happens, there's no guarantee it's not going to happen again. Think about it. That Freya Warrington was attacked in the downstairs lobby on the ground floor of our apartments. What if it happens again? I'm not going to hang around to find out, that's for sure. Thanks for your advice. I'll think about it long and hard, but I do think that the death of Freya Warrington was actually personal. I don't think there is a murderer in our midst. That's just my opinion. And is it a risk you're willing to take? I wouldn't if I was you. From what Sharon had learnt via the grapevine, that it would seem no arrests had been made concerning the case, and over the last month she had experienced numerous sightings of Red around the apartment block. On one occasion she had overheard him talking to a friend of his.
She was slumped over there. Can you believe that? I tried to wake her up, because I thought she was as drunk as a skunk, but she was bloody dead. It looked like someone had deliberately positioned her like that, propped her up against the wall like a doll, if you know what I mean.
Sharon had not known what to make of Red, but he'd seemed pleased to have been the one to have discovered the deceased body, and rather unruffled by what had happened. But she was sure he would have been interrogated by the police by now, and would surely have been locked up, and the key thrown away, if they had thought he was responsible for Freya's death. So maybe Brenda Larkin was right after all, that Red was harmless. But what about his friends? They were a different story. Some of them looked a tad unsavoury. As Sharon thought about her roommate's death, she could not help but wonder why a random stranger would just pounce on Freya Warrington for no reason at all. She did not believe there was a predator in their midst, like Brenda so obviously did. It made no sense. There was something deeply personal about this murder, as far as she was concerned, and she didn't believe for a second that living in an apartment block imposed any risk for her. As far as she was concerned, someone wanted Freya Warrington dead, but who and why? That was the $1,001,000 question. As Sharon began to empty out Freya's closet, something got her immediate attention. It was a scrunched up piece of paper that in the police search had lightly fallen out of the dustbin, landing on the floor half under the bed. She bent down to retrieve it, to replace it back in the bin. When she opened the paper, to her surprise, there was nothing written on it at all. But then her eyes were drawn to the loose floorboards directly under the bed that she had meant to get fixed a long time ago, but had never done it. For reasons even Sharon could not explain, she found herself pulling back the floorboards to look beneath them, as they were the perfect hidey-hole to hide any of your secrets. And that was when she discovered 2 hardback books lying discreetly hidden beneath them, with Freya's name on the front, and one book marked with the word diary, and the other with the word my private pictures. Of course Sharon knew the right thing to do would be to call the police, for the information in the diary might be of considerable help to them with their ongoing investigation. But Sharon was curious. It wouldn't hurt to have a little peek, she persuaded herself. It might help her to learn a little bit more about her mysterious roommate, and she wanted to find out exactly why Freya had been killed, and maybe she might find some answers to that question in these books. She had a burning need to know what had happened to Freya on that Friday evening, when she returned home to the apartment, where she'd been jumped and then strangled, and whoever had attacked her had left her looking as if she was lying drunk in the corridor. With trembling hands, and feeling rather guilty about what she was about to do, like someone who knows they're putting their nose where it clearly does not belong, she hesitantly opened the book marked pictures, and looked nervously over her shoulders, almost as if half expecting someone to pull her aside and reprimand her for prying into somebody else's business. But nothing happened. Sharon reasoned with herself that Freya was dead now. She was no longer attached to the material things of this world any more. She was beyond that now. And what harm would it do to look at these private books that Freya had hidden under the floorboards, which suggested she might have something to hide? Either that, or she was terrified of anybody knowing her private and personal business. Freya opened the book marked pictures first. Most of the pictures she scanned through the book was pretty benign, but she realized that Freya was an accomplished artist. One picture was of a butterfly resting on a flower, and Freya had fully captured all the intimate details of its bright colours. Under it was a caption that read, "Butterfly I saw in the meadow today." There was another picture of a mother deer and her fawn. One was of a magnolia tree in blossom, another of a caterpillar. It would seem that Freya had a deep attachment and affinity to the natural world. No wonder she had told Sharon the city wasn't really for her, and she'd only moved here to advance her career in graphic design. That now made perfect sense. When Sharon turned over the next page of the rather benevolent-looking pictures, her eyes were on stalks when the next picture she observed was of a gargantuan-sized male Bigfoot, standing between the trees looking straight ahead of him. The picture was so intricately detailed, so beautifully drawn, and underneath it Freya had written, "I saw him again. He was watching me through some open branches in the trees, eating some leaves. We locked eyes together. He was terribly shy, rather bashful actually, but he glided away. I do hope I see him again. There was something so unique about him that I really liked. These things are real. I felt tingles all over my body after the experience. I know what happened to me was so special. I think he wanted me to see him, so I feel honoured that he showed himself to me." Sharon found a few more pictures of the Bigfoot that had previously been drawn in different positions. The captions read, "He's always watching me. He's so dreadfully curious. I'm not afraid of him at all because he means me no harm. I really like his energy. He's comical and kind." Another caption read, "When I was walking in the woods this morning, I was hoping to see him again. I was feeling really down in the dumps because my mother's sister passed away from stage 4 cancer. I was grieving her loss. I don't know if the Bigfoot could pick up on my sorrow, but I think he could because he showed himself to me again. I saw him very clearly through the trees. He threw an apple at me. I think he wants to be my friend, and that made me feel so happy. He is, of course, painfully shy. I took the apple and ate it, while he continued to peek at me through the shrubbery, watching me all the time. I detected what I can only describe as a friendly twinkle in his dark eyes, as if he was saying, 'I'm glad to see you again.' I genuinely think he was pleased when I ate the apple he'd thrown for me. He whistled and clapped his hands. I genuinely think he was pleased that I accepted his gift. I was so touched he would do something so nice for me like this. I think he's getting used to me being around. The only reason I go into the woods as often as I do is because I hope to see him. But he's so elusive, and yet I always know he's there. When other members of my family go into the woods, they see nothing at all, which makes my random encounters with him all the more special. I think that this Bigfoot's taken a shine to me, for some reason, which is why he revealed himself to me. I do believe I would not have seen him if he'd not wished me to do so. I always sense him watching me, even when I can't see him at all. I don't encounter him every time I go into the woods. It's so weird to experience that. It's like he wears an invisible cloak, so that it's almost impossible to see him. I admit I'm growing increasingly curious about him, as he is about me. The feeling is mutual, and yet I think we're both cautious about getting comfortable with each other. He's incredibly human to look at in every regard. I'll never ever tell anyone about him, not in a million trillion years. Even if people say Bigfoot is real, I'll never agree with them on that. I don't want people intruding on this creature's space. He deserves to live a peaceful, long and contented life. The good news is many people don't believe that Bigfoot exists. I'd like to keep it that way. The creatures deserve to live among us without being harassed. I went online and read so many horrible, nasty, mean things about Bigfoot. I'm talking about horrible, horrible, horrible things. There are people out there that want to actually kill these creatures. They've been described as dangerous. Maybe some of them are. I have no knowledge of these things. I can only talk from my own personal experience. I know unequivocally the Bigfoot I'm seeing is nicer than a whole lot of humans I've met over the years. So I think the bad press has got to be exaggerated. Either that or, like human beings, you get good and bad Bigfoots. But the one I've encountered is very benevolent. Then another caption read, I was walking alone in the woods today. I could feel the Bigfoot around me, sense his benevolent energy, but I couldn't see him anywhere. I thought I wasn't going to see him, as I hardly ever do. But on this particular occasion I saw some shrubbery move on its own, and a comical-looking cone-shaped head began peering at me through the undergrowth, looking at me with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. I stood still and just watched the Bigfoot. He pushed the undergrowth back and walked straight out of the trees towards me, swinging his arms and legs backwards and forwards. His movements were so graceful for one so large. I think he'd grown used to me being around. He's beginning to slowly but surely trust me. I was amazed by his sheer size. I mean, he was gargantuan. My drawings don't give any idea of his size, but I think he could have easily been over 9 foot tall. I don't think my pictures convey his muscle definition adequately enough, and his huge ponderous shoulders. I just wish I could do his eyes justice in my pictures, like they are in real life, but I can't catch his essence, that bright, incredible sparkle. It's like his eyes are like the twinkling stars you see in the sky at night. There's an energy about him that I can't explain, that pulls you right in. It was like I wanted to be close to him, so some of this energy could rub off on me in some way. I couldn't believe it when he indicated for me to stretch out my hand. He was hiding something behind his back, and he pulled out an apple for me. I took it, laughed, and gave him a big smile. We both stood there staring at each other. He had an apple for himself as well, so we ate together. I know it sounds really strange, but he spoke to me in my head telepathically. He just said 2 words, "You're nice," and then glided away. I asked myself, of course, if I'd imagined those words. I've been going over them again and again in my head, but I know he said, "You're nice." I wish I'd said it back to him, because he really is very nice. The final caption about the Bigfoot underneath another drawing read, I came home from the weekend from Atlanta. I went to the woods looking for him. I wish I had a name I could call him by. It would be so much easier that way. My mother cannot understand this fixation of mine to keep going into the woods soon after I get home. But I can't help myself, can I? I really want to see my Bigfoot friend. He's my best-kept secret, a secret I will take with me to the grave if I have my way. I felt really bad because my brother Stuart offered to accompany me into the woods. I refused his request. I was worried if he came along with me that there would be absolutely no chance of my seeing my Bigfoot friend. Furthermore, he wanted to bring Buffy into the woods with us, and that rambunctious, overexcitable dog would scare anything off. I think poor Stuart thought I was giving him the brush off. He looked a little put out, as I haven't seen him in over 3 weeks. But I was so eager to see my Bigfoot friend. How could I tell him about that? I just said I fancied a walk alone. I had been walking in the woods for quite some time, and then I heard what I can only describe as these thunderous feet moving towards me. The next thing I heard twigs snapping, leaves being crunched, and heavy breathing. Then I saw him pulling back the shrubbery, walking towards me. He had a warm, friendly twinkle in his eyes, but there was a troubled, somewhat unsettled, disquieted look on his face, almost as if something was really beginning to bother him. He indicated for me to stretch out my hand. I did as he said, thinking he was going to give me another one of his apples that we would be able to share together. but instead he gave me a black stone, which he placed in my palm, folding my fingers over the stone so that I was holding it tightly in my hands. He looked at me and said,
"Keep the stone to absorb the darkness. It wants to take you away. Don't let it get you."
I looked at the stone and then back at the Bigfoot, and we stared at each other. I said nothing. I was thinking in my mind, did he really speak to me like that? And an answer came back to me.
"Of course I spoke to you. You need to stay safe. Keep the stone with you at all times. Don't let it out of your sight. It's very important. It will protect you."
On the weekend I'd left the stone on my nightstand, and unfortunately the cleaner threw it away. I mean, why would she do a thing like that? It made me feel really bad that she had thrown it out. I felt slightly intimidated that the Bigfoot said that the darkness wanted to take me away. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but it's really scary. I do regret not having the stone to protect me. I asked the cleaner why she threw it away. She said it looked like a piece of coal. I've never heard anything so ridiculous in all my life. That stone was full of sparkly stuff, bits of gold and silver, bits of red. It was unique. It was stunning. Let me tell you, it was not a piece of coal. My mother's cleaner seriously needs a pair of glasses. As Sharon read the last caption, her blood went icy cold. Had the Bigfoot that Freya encountered in the woods on her parents' land given her the black stone to keep her safe? Had he perceived that Freya was in grave danger? Sharon stared incredulously at the pictures and the captions under them. It was clear that this was a book she was not meant to see, and this was one she would never show to anyone, as based on what Freya had written in her captions, she wanted no one to know about her Bigfoot encounter or about her unusual friend, and Sharon wanted to honour her wish. Sharon had never given the cryptid creatures much thought. It was not that she hadn't believed or disbelieved in the subject of Bigfoot. She had always just assumed that Bigfoot was a fictitious character, like Father Christmas and the Easter Bunny. But now she knew differently. There was no doubt in Sharon's mind that Freya's Bigfoot encounter in the woods, on her family's property in North Carolina, was very real, and she was rather intrigued by this revelation, and not entirely sure what to make of it all. Sharon then rather gingerly opened the second book, not totally sure what she would find. She was surprised to see that it was a diary with not many exciting entries, but it was towards the end of the diary that it began to look interesting, giving Sharon a bird's eye view as to why Freya Warrington had been so eager to move in with her. She ran her eyes through many of the comments which she read. Tuesday the 12th. I wish I hadn't moved in with him. His name is Barry Baldwin. I mean, he seemed harmless enough when I first met him, and the apartment was ever so attractive. I didn't think it would be a problem. He told me he had a girlfriend who lived with him at the flat. I believed him, but now I don't believe he was telling me the truth. I mean, when I returned to the apartment this evening, there was no sign of his so-called girlfriend anywhere around. I also had a profound sense he was waiting up for me. I didn't like that one little bit. I'm not answerable to him. I'm not a kid. When I got into the apartment, the way he was looking at me, well, it wasn't good. I felt distinctly uncomfortable, ill at ease. I think he might actually fancy me, and that's part of the problem. He asked me if I wanted a drink, so I said no thanks. I hurriedly went into my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I didn't feel particularly safe. I'm really beginning to regret not moving in with a girl. I feel uneasy about my new living circumstances. There's something rather off about Barry Baldwin. And if he's got a girlfriend, why is he not living with her? Those inappropriate looks, I keep thinking about them. I know I'm not imagining this. Thursday the 15th. I got into the apartment last night. Everything was quiet. Very quiet. Uncomfortably so. But I hasten to say I felt relief that Barry Baldwin wasn't waiting up for me at the late hours of the night. It would have freaked me out if I was to have a repeat of Tuesday night, with him asking me to join him for a drink and looking at me with that hungry look in his eyes. I mean, I barely know the man. We've exchanged a few pleasantries of sorts, and that's about it. The truth is, I don't want to get to know him. I don't believe he has a girlfriend. Why is there no sign of a woman's presence around the flat? Unless, of course, they recently broke up. When I applied to live at the apartment, he said his girlfriend lived at the flat most of the time. It was this revelation that made me feel comfortable about moving in with a man. There would have been 3 of us living here. But I think this girlfriend is bogus. I don't believe she exists. Everything around the apartment is so masculine now I come to think about it. There's nothing to suggest a woman has ever been around this place. I was heartily relieved to get into my bedroom, to close the door behind me, plunge the key into my lock. I think the moment I hit my bed, I was out like a light. But at one point of the night, I had an ever so lucid dream. It felt so startlingly real, and I'm beginning to think it may well have been. I was looking up from my bed through dozy eyes. Barry Baldwin was there, standing in my bedroom, staring at me so gormlessly. It was the weirdest experience of my life. I don't know what to make of it. I've been telling myself to stop being so ludicrous. As of course, how could Barry have got into a locked room? Unless, of course, he has a spare key. I've been telling myself this was a nasty, inauspicious dream. But why? Why did it feel so real? And that feeling of him just standing there in my room, staring at me, is so disquieting. It had to have been a dream, surely. But there was a strange after-smell in my room, following that dream. I have no idea where that came from. Saturday the 17th. Last night it happened again. I enjoyed a few drinks and some pizzas with friends after work. I got back to the apartment at about 12:30. I bumped into Barry Baldwin in the hallway. Talk about bad timing. He claimed he'd only got back and asked me to join him for a drink. I told him I was far too tired and needed to go to bed. I swear he looked quite put out by that. I might even go so far to say as he looked angry, but I couldn't be sure. It was so unfortunate to bump into him like that. I had sincerely hoped I'd be able to avoid him, but there he was, like a bad smell that never seems to abate. He was watching me as I went into my bedroom. I am regretting so very much having moved in here. It was a catastrophic mistake on my part. There is something not right about that man. When I got into bed, I pretty much floated away into sleep. But I had that lurid dream again. There he was, Barry Baldwin, standing there in my bedroom. This time he was smoking as he watched me sleeping. In my dream I could smell that smoke and see his face just leering at me. It was so creepy. Once again, when I woke up from my dream, I felt visibly shaken. It had felt vividly real to me. But the horrifying thing was I found a cigarette stub on my floor the following morning. How can I explain that? I don't smoke, so I believe Barry has been letting himself into my room, opening my bedroom with a spare key he obviously owns, just watching me sleep. Furthermore, there was that strange smell in the room again. I was so freaked out. I had to call a locksmith at once to change the key to my door. This can never ever happen again. But one thing is clear. I need to move out as soon as possible. I can't hang around with a creep like that. Sunday the 18th. How I wish I'd spent the weekend with my parents at home in North Carolina. But unfortunately I had far too much to do. But when I went to bed last night with the locks now safely changed, I heard someone fumbling around with them during the night, trying to enter my bedroom. I knew at once it was Barry Baldwin. I now know for sure those dreams of mine were not fictitious dreams at all. I believe he's been creeping into my bedroom, sometimes smoking and just watching me while I sleep. I mean, how creepy is that? I'm not sure how he can do this to me without me waking up fully alert. But I'm wondering if that strange smell in my room that he's been burning keeps me sedated or something, so he can watch me sleep without me being consciously aware of his absurd nocturnal activities. The man is sick, seriously sick, deranged. Why the hell did I agree to move in with him? If my mother had any idea this was going on, she would do her nut. But I told her I'm living with a close friend, so I cannot tell her the truth. I have to sort this mess out myself. Monday the 19th. When I got back to the apartment, Barry was waiting up for me in the living room, like a father waiting up for his teenage daughter, who is not amused because she's returned home past her curfew. It felt rather like that. I could tell he was slightly inebriated. "Where have you been?" he asked me, slurring his words. He had a beer bottle in his hands. He was waving it around. I was shocked because it was none of his business where I'd been. "I've been working late," I told him curtly.
"Liar! You're a liar!" he said, slamming his beer bottle on the couch.
It rolled on its side, parking itself against a cushion.
"You're seeing someone behind my back. I know you are. That's what's going on here, isn't it? You've been seeing someone."
"Excuse me, Barry. I'm not your girlfriend," I said. "It doesn't matter if I'm seeing anyone or not. It's none of your business. I'm your roommate, nothing more. Who I see is of no concern to you. I think you've had too much to drink, Barry. The alcohol's gone straight to your head, making you say things you're going to regret in the morning. I'll pretend I never heard what you said." Barry got up from his chair and hobbled over towards me.
"Why are you being so aloof, so cold-hearted, so indifferent? You're a bitch. You know that? A real bitch. You didn't move in here just to be my roommate, did you? You know that. I know that. There's more going on between us, isn't there? Don't deny it. You feel it too."
"I don't feel anything. I think you're drunk, Barry. Let me go to my bedroom," I said hurriedly, feeling desperate need to get away from him. I could hear him ranting when I went into my room. He began throwing beers at the walls, and I kept hearing him say,
"Oh, she's a bitch. She's a bitch. She'll pay for this. She'll pay for this."
When I locked my door during the night, I felt very apprehensive. Red lights were flashing in my head. I knew I needed to get away from this place. Barry was not right in the head. I'm genuinely scared of the man. I don't know what he's capable of. I'm going to make some calls and see if I can find another flat share. This is absolutely not working out. I seem to remember Kate Barlow telling me there's a young lady by the name of Sharon who's looking for a new flatmate. I'll give her a call in the morning. Tuesday the 20th. I went to see this lady Kate had told me about. I was so nervous. Her name is Sharon. She seemed really nice, but I was so terrified she was going to not let me move in straight away. But thankfully she did. I couldn't believe my luck. I was out of Barry's place so fast. I never have to see that awful man again as long as I live. I left him a note telling him it wasn't working out. I don't doubt he won't be best pleased. I'm pretty sure that man has a violent temper on him. I'm not surprised he hasn't got a girlfriend. He's far too wacko for a relationship of any kind. No woman in their right mind would date a man like that. All I can say is thank God I didn't pay him an advance in the rent, or otherwise I really would be in a financial pickle. As Sharon read Freya's diary, she had a full insight of what Freya had been going through days before she'd moved in with her. It would seem her accounts of believing Barry Baldwin had been watching her while she was sleeping were very disquieting. It was hardly surprising she'd left the apartment in such a hurry. Could it be that Barry Baldwin was behind her fortuitous passing? Had he managed to find out where she lived and come after her, wreaking his revenge? Sharon knew that she needed to call Detective Cox right away. It wasn't long before he arrived at her front door. She led him into the apartment, wishing once again she was wearing something a little bit more fetching. The man was so handsome. She made sure to check whether he was wearing a ring on his finger or not, but there was no ring. She drew in a sigh of relief.
"What is all this about, Sharon? You said it was urgent. I assume there is something that you are going to tell me to do with the fortuitous death of your roommate." Am I right about that?
But of course. I'm going up to the funeral in North Carolina. I'm staying with the Warringtons. I've been packing up a suitcase with all of Freya's things to take with me, as Mrs. Warrington, well, she didn't want to go through her daughter's stuff, as you can imagine. She said it would be far too upsetting for her. She asked me to do it instead.
So you're going to the funeral? I thought it was only for close family and friends.
Well, Mrs. Warrington seems to think that me and her daughter were very close. I mean, how could I tell her the truth? So I went along with it. It seemed like the kindest thing to do. I think Freya told her parents she was moving in with a close friend, so they felt comfortable of her living alone in a city, you see.
I see. So you called me here to tell me this, did you?
He said, raising an eyebrow, his eyes catching Sharon's for a brief moment. She was sure she'd felt a spark between them, but he was so professional. There was no chink in this man's armour. No, that's not the reason I called you, Detective Cox. It's this, said Sharon, holding out a diary for the detective to read. Detective Cox took the diary from Sharon.
Where did you find this?
Well, I think Freya hid it under the floorboards under her bed. I removed the floorboards to look if she had hidden anything in there, and sure enough, I found the diary there.
I see, said the detective, looking into Sharon's eyes with an amused glint. I take it, Sharon, that you've read this, have you?
Sharon flushed. I admit I did, but I wanted to see if there was anything in there that the police might find of interest.
We find everything of interest, Sharon. You should have called us at once.
I know, and I'm sorry about that, said Sharon, raising a defensive hand. But I just thought I'd read a little.
How little is a little, Sharon?
Sharon's face became as red as a field of poppies. All right, I confess I read the whole thing. I care about Freya Warrington, you see. I want the man responsible for her death to be locked away for life.
Detective Cox was grinning broadly. You'd make a good detective, Sharon. Snooping can be quite handy in our profession, and you don't seem to be adverse to it. Do you fancy doing my job?
No, of course I don't, Detective, said Sharon rather tentatively. Detective Cox, when you read Freya's entries, you'll realise why she abandoned living with Barry Baldwin, why she moved in with me. The man was creepy. He broke into her bedroom during the night to watch her sleep. Who does that?
He did what? Asked Detective Cox, his face growing pale.
So you agree with me that that is weird?
It's not normal. Thank you for the diary, Sharon. I will be in touch.
Wait, Detective Cox. How is the investigation over Freya's death going? It's just I've heard nothing. It's so frustrating.
Well, we're chasing up new leads, Sharon. But this diary might be the very thing to change the case for us. Thank you for bringing this matter to my attention.
It's only a pleasure, Detective, said Sharon, who had no intention of ever showing Detective Cox, or anyone else for that matter, the pictures of the Bigfoot in the book marked My Private Pictures, which she had decided she'd probably have to burn. Sharon set off rather happily on her road journey to North Carolina. As the under 6 hours trip was not too far a drive for her, it wasn't intimidating. She didn't fancy lugging all Freya's luggage around at the airport. She knew she'd thoroughly enjoy getting behind the wheel of her car and driving out on the open road. Now that she knew so much more about Freya Warrington, she did feel almost intimately acquainted with the Warrington family. She was sharing a secret with Freya Warrington that nobody else knew about, and that in itself was a great feeling. If she got a chance, she wouldn't mind taking a walk in the woodgrove to see whereabouts Freya had had her encounter with the male Bigfoot. She had never anticipated the welcome she'd actually received from the Warrington family when she arrived at their beguiling little farmhouse in the countryside. Mrs. Fanny Warrington came dashing towards her, throwing her arms around Sharon, as if she was the last remaining connection to her daughter. "It is so good to see you, Sharon, love. You know I am just over the moon you've come here. You have no idea how wonderful it is to finally meet you, love. I just so wish it could be under better circumstances. Thank you for driving all the way up to North Carolina." "It's only a pleasure," she had said. The Warrington family had fussed around her, as if she was a celebrity of note, as if she needed to be pampered within an inch of her life. and even the family's large Newfoundland dog, Buffy, seemed to think Sharon was a bit of all right, as he kept trying to lick her face like a popsicle.
"I think he likes you, Buffy, I mean," said Stuart, who was Freya's brother. "He's a discerning dog, you know."
"Really?" laughed Sharon. "I don't think so. I think anything he would grab hold of he'd probably lick to death." And her comments had made even Fanny Warrington laugh.
"Discerning? Where on earth did you get that idea from, Stuart?" she chuckled. "That dog of ours would quite happily lead burglars into our property and just say to them, 'Help yourself, take what you need. But fancy a game of ball while you're at it.' That's Buffy for you, all over." All right, said Stuart. "Maybe he's not as discerning, but he definitely does like Sharon. Look how he's lying over her feet like he did when Freya was here. He doesn't do that to everyone. You have to admit that." "Well, you make a good point, dear," said Fanny, smiling warmly at Freya. And even though her smile was bright, Freya could see the deep sadness etched in the lines around her eyes. The whole family was trying to be positive and upbeat, but she could tell that Freya's death had knocked them for six, and they were all feeling a little like a family of fish that had been knocked out of their water. "I tell you what," said Fanny suddenly, her face brightening. "Would you like to see Freya's bedroom, Sharon? You're being her good friend and that. I thought it might interest you seeing it. I'm always going to leave it just the way it is, so Freya knows that she's never forgotten wherever she is."
"I'd love to see her room, Fanny, if that's not too much of an imposition."
"But of course it's not. Absolutely not."
"But just so you know, I'm pretty sure Freya knows that she's not forgotten. She knows how much you all loved her as a family. She told me how close she was to you all. She adored coming home to the countryside. She was supposed to come home on the day she died, but then she decided to return to the apartment instead. She said she had stuff she still needed to do in town."
"I know, and more's the pity that. I keep going over that in my head," said Fanny Warrington, looking sorrowful. "If only she had come home, then none of this would have happened. She said she had so much work to do, so she would have to leave it until next weekend to come to the countryside. I was very sad about it, but I understood, of course, that being in the town, with her job in graphic design, there were a lot of demands on her. I couldn't expect to see her every weekend. But this, no, I never expected any of this to happen."
She didn't like the city much. Sharon allowed Mrs. Warrington to lead her into Freya's bedroom. The first thing she observed was the black stone on the side table. Was that the black stone that the Bigfoot had given her, she wondered? In Freya's journal she said the stone had been discarded by the cleaner. "Mrs. Warrington, I mean Fanny, you see that black stone on the side table next to Freya's bed? Well, I thought it had been thrown away by the cleaner."
"Oh, she told you about that, did she? Well, it's nice she confides in a friend like you. If you must know, Freya was upset with the cleaner, terribly upset. There are no words to describe how overwrought she was. The cleaner thought she'd just thrown away a piece of coal. Anyway, she literally had to search the entire dumpster to see if she could find the stone for Freya, because Freya was so upset about it. I think Freya found the stone in the woods and was keeping it as a memento of sorts, and things like that always meant an awful lot to her for some reason. Poor Sophie, she felt really bad about discarding the stone, as Freya was so upset about it. She claimed that the stone was very special to her, you see."
Sharon picked up the stone and studied it. "Well, it's definitely not a piece of coal. I don't understand how the cleaner could think it was. Can't you see there's specks of gold in it? It's a beautiful stone."
"Oh, yes, I do see," said Fanny Warrington, peering at the stone more closely. "It's lovelier than I thought it was. I can see why my daughter liked it so much. It's very unusual. I wonder where she found it. Look at those sparkles in the stone. Bits of silver, bits of gold, bits of red. Rather alluring, isn't it? When I told her the cleaner had emptied out all the trash bins to recover it for her, and that we had found her precious stone, she was absolutely thrilled. She was looking forward to picking it up when she came home for the weekend. My daughter loved things from the natural world, you know, Sharon. She collected driftwood, seashells, stuff like that to paint. She was quite the aspiring artist. You see those pictures of insects that are framed on the wall over there? Those were done by my daughter. I mean, look at the details of that bee and that moth. It's like looking at the real-life insect under a magnified lens, is it not? The details are so precise.
It's incredible, said Sharon in awe. You're right. The detail's absolutely amazing. She could actually draw pictures for biology and science books, for Natural Geographic and stuff like that. Make a living out of it. They look so lifelike, so real. She was incredibly talented. I had no idea she was that good.
Well, she did rather hide her light under a bushel. I'd like you to take something from this bedroom, Sharon. Anything that might be a special memento of Freya for you. It can be a bag, a picture, anything that reminds you of my daughter.
Would it be all right if I kept the stone?
Only if you would like it, love. But I must insist you take a picture of hers. You can look through her folders. She's got many of them in the garage, you know. Pictures of hummingbirds, stuff like that. Things like that I think you will rather like.
It sounds lovely, Fanny, said Sharon appreciatively. But are you sure you don't mind parting with these things? And the stone, are you sure about the stone?
Oh, absolutely. I don't need that stone. And I know Freya would love you to have it, especially as you seem to appreciate it so much.
After spending a thoroughly enjoyable day with the Warringtons, which ended off with a special evening meal to celebrate Freya's life, where the delicious and hearty food had been created by an illustrious chef who had been hired for the evening, Mrs. Warrington seemed to pick at her plate rather nervously. It was clear the weight of her daughter's death had robbed her of any appetite, and not even the most mouth-watering delectable food could even tempt her palate. Later that evening the family had played darts and had a few drinks together. Sharon soon retired to bed, knowing that in the morning it would be the private funeral ceremony and memorial service for Freya. She knew for the Warringtons saying goodbye to their daughter would be grievously hard. The Warringtons had given her a bedroom and bathroom en suite on the lower floor of their upper-story farmhouse. They had turned the room out so superbly. It looked like an illustrious suite in an upmarket fancy hotel. Mrs. Warrington had generously put out magazines, bowls of fruit and flowers all over the bedroom, which was such a thoughtful and generous thing for her to do. Sharon had warmed to the Warringtons, who had told her that they'd like her to become a very good family friend, as Freya's untimely death had ultimately created a bond between them all. The bedroom had sliding doors that led out onto a private wraparound porch with steps that descended into the backyard. In the furthest distance you could see the backdrop of tall, lofty trees on the horizon, that at this time of the night looked like ambiguous, dark cardboard cutouts. The bedroom was so beautiful with its pale mint-green colour scheme. A sleigh bed made from dark wood was covered with soft mint-green quilts and luxurious sheets that Sharon was absolutely certain had to be Egyptian cotton. She drew back the sliding doors of the bedroom, and a soft breeze filtered through the room. The curtains began to swing backwards and forwards, like the sails on a boat. The cooling breeze was rather pleasant. Sharon decided to sit out on the porch for a brief while, where she allowed her fatigued body to slump back rather casually against the Adirondack sun lounger with its comfortable upholstered backing. This was the perfect place for her to relax, where she could wistfully stargaze up in the night sky, collecting her thoughts together before finally retiring to her bed. There was no doubt being around a grieving family had been draining. It was such a prepossessing night. Sharon could fully comprehend why it was that Freya loved coming back home so much, to this wonderful serene place every weekend, as the welcoming, fun-loving Warrington family were genuinely warm, hospitable and friendly. They had gone to great lengths to make Sharon feel at home. She couldn't help but feel that they were a little like the Waltons, the perfect all-American family. Beyond that, they really did live in an idyllic, spectacular part of the world. upholstered by woodlands, meadows, undulating hills, silvery ponds, ubiquitous tall lofty trees that eagerly splashed their viridescent colour across the countryside in resplendent greens that could literally take your breath away, they were so vivid. When Sharon had first arrived here, she'd been awestruck by the natural landscape and beauty, by the clean, crisp air, and the feeling of so much sprawling space that swaddled you on every side. What was there not to like about this place? In her eyes, it was absolutely perfect. Out here you felt as if you were on vacation, as if all your troubles you could leave behind in the city, that they were no longer of any consequence anymore. It was like you could breathe to the rhythm and the heartbeat of the natural world, drink in her sweet dewy nectar, surrender to her drum rolls, and allow your mind to be swept away by the gentle breezes, like a dandelion seed on the wind, where you could almost become one with absolutely everything around you. It was so incredibly comfortable lying there on the Adirondack chair, on this warm, friendly, congenial night, staring up blissfully into the night sky, while in her hand she was playing with the black stone that Fanny Warrington had given her. She began unconsciously tracing its hard granular texture with her fingers. It seemed incredibly warm to the touch. For a moment she gazed up at the night sky and thought she saw a couple of shooting stars. She made a wish on both of them. One was that Freya Warrington had found her peace, wherever she was, and on the other shooting star, she wished that Freya's murderer would be brought to justice. She closed her eyes and her eyelids were beginning to tug in a downward droop. She tried to resist their willful need to close, but she could no longer fight against the tugging sensation that was dragging her deeper and deeper into a sleep, almost against her will. She had wanted to remain awake to watch the stars a little longer, and then to go back to bed, cocooned in the deliciously crisp Egyptian cotton sheets of the sumptuous cosy bed that awaited her. But it was so good lying out here under the stars, and the woolly sensation of drifting away on a white fluffy cloud overcame her, and so very finally she slipped into a dreamy state, surrounded by the tuneful chorus of crickets and frogs, until she surrendered to sleep. Sharon awoke very suddenly to the strange, very certain feeling. She was not alone. Where was she? She felt disorientated and confused. She was lying out on an Adirondack chair, on a wraparound porch, outside the guest bedroom on the Warringtons' property. This she gleaned in a few seconds as she became conscious of her surroundings. Yet in this revelatory moment, she kept her eyes tightly shut, as she listened to the tuneful background sounds of the night, almost as if she was in a coma in a hospital, waking up to the strange noises around her. She lay there not wishing to open her eyes at all, or to drag herself from the delicious sensations of her sleep. Waking it up would almost certainly spoil it all, drag her straight back to reality with a huge, nasty jolt. She lay there with her eyes closed. Once again she got the haunting sensation that she was not alone, that someone was there. Sharon lifted up her shoulder and head rather begrudgingly, wiping away the debris of sleep from her eyes, and opened her eyes very slowly. At first she saw nothing but the soft shafts of pretty moonlight that spilled on the porch from a dark sky that looked rather like a velvet evening gown, studded with many twinkling diamonds. But when she looked around, everything looked benign. It was a tranquil night, but the feeling that she was not alone was all-consuming. Sharon shifted her position on the Adirondack chair and directed her gaze around the porch, from the left to the right. It was in the soft pillar of moonlight she saw him, standing there at the bottom of the porch steps, looking straight up at her. She was so shocked she didn't know how to react. Surely she was seeing things. She had to be. She closed her eyes again and opened them, but he was still standing there, larger than life. It was a male Bigfoot. The Bigfoot seemed to allow Sharon to take him in, to adjust to his unlikely presence where he stood at the bottom of the porch steps, just staring at her. It was almost as if he appreciated that her unlikely encounter with him might actually be a tad unsettling. Sharon couldn't see him too clearly, and for that she was heartily grateful, for in a full conspicuous glaring light, She was in no doubt she'd have been a lot more intimidated and overwhelmed. If she had wanted to scream, that would not have been possible, for her jaws seemed to be tightly locked and her body frozen to the spot. Sharon wasn't exactly afraid. That would not be the right word to use, but bemused might be the best way to describe her current mindset. She didn't believe it was an accident that the Bigfoot was standing there at the bottom of the porch steps looking up at her, as if he was not there by random chance, or that she had just encountered him on a whim. It was like there was an expectation written all over his face, and then suddenly Sharon was filled with a sense of knowing, as the Bigfoot's treacle-coloured eyes dropped down to the Adirondack chair where she was sitting, focusing on the black stone lying loosely by her side that had fallen away from her hands.
Sharon suddenly realized the Bigfoot was after the black stone. He'd come to get it back, she realized. She picked up the black stone, showing it to the Bigfoot. "You want this?" she asked in her mind. The Bigfoot responded with a voice in her head. "I need it back. I had it on loan to help the girl. But she's gone now. It has no use for her any more," he said, looking sad. Sharon thought about Freya and realized that this must be her Bigfoot friend, the creature who'd warned her to keep the stone, which she had failed to do. "You liked her, didn't you?" she asked in her head. The Bigfoot replied, "She was very nice." Sharon rose to her feet and walked over to the Bigfoot, with absolutely no fear in her heart, for he was incredibly imposing, but there was something so reassuring about this benevolent being, and his presence brought her comfort. For a second her eyes met with the Bigfoot's. He took the stone from her and nodded. "You're nice," he said in his head. "You're like her, but I miss my friend. I knew she would not be here long. The black cloud was chasing after her, but she's in a good place now, and for that I am most pleased." Sharon couldn't believe she was engaging in conversation with the male Bigfoot, without any words being used, in some kind of telepathic exchange, where words just seemed to enter her head. "You knew she was going to die, didn't you?" Sharon asked in her head, to which the Bigfoot responded, "You have no idea what a responsibility it is to read energy, for knowing things is not always a good thing, you know." Those were the last words Sharon remembered from the Bigfoot, as she had looked directly into his loving eyes, and beyond that everything else that may or may not have happened faded from her recall in an ambiguous foggy haze. When she awoke the following morning, she found she had failed to make it to bed. She was still lying back on the Adirondack sun lounger. Her strange encounter with the male Bigfoot seemed all but a dream, but it had been so vivid, so explicit, she doubted it had been a dream. When she looked around for the dark stone, it was gone, and then she knew that her encounter with the male Bigfoot had been no dream at all.
The funeral for Freya Warrington had been a private, special, very personalised affair for family and friends alike. The quintessential opportunity for people who loved Freya to be able to say their goodbyes to her. Many tears were shed. Flowers were generously thrown over the gravesite. Prayers were prayed. Poems were read. White doves released from their baskets as they ascended into the heavens with such grace, along with a plethora of white hot air balloons with Freya's name embossed on the front and the words "Rest in Peace" underneath it in silver. It was a moving moment that Sharon would never be likely to forget. Everybody embraced each other warmly in their grief, and Sharon found herself in tears of a precious life so needlessly lost, and a family so dreadfully burdened by so much grief. In those poignant moments she wondered about the senselessness of everything, probably a thought that others in attendance were lightly sharing. Mrs. Warrington remained stoic throughout, thanking everyone graciously for coming, and when the family finally returned home, with Freya seated in the back seat next to Stuart, who should be waiting for them, parked in their driveway, in his rather distinctive red Jeep, the very handsome Detective Cox himself. "Goodness gracious me," said Mrs. Warrington. "I do believe that is Detective Cox's car. What on earth is he doing here? Maybe he's got some news about the investigation. Oh, I do hope so," she said, her voice unable to disguise the hope. "Whoever harmed my daughter, I want them hung, drawn and quartered." Mrs. Warrington reached out to grab her husband's hands.
I hope you're not getting your hopes up, love. I hate to tell you, but these investigations can sometimes go on for a long time, he said, nudging his wife. Detective Cox had asked to have a private word with the family in their living room, so Sharon decided to make herself scarce. Detective Cox had told the Warringtons he would let himself out, for whatever he had told them had in some way left them a little shell-shocked and bemused, as if they needed some private time to recuperate and absorb the full impact of the sobering news. So Sharon guessed at once that there had been a huge advancement in the case, which explained why Detective Cox had paid the Warringtons a visit, on the day of the funeral most especially. She had overheard Mrs. Warrington's final words before the detective had left the living room. "Well, I hope he rots in hell, Detective Cox." And that had been followed by a cacophony of sobs. Sharon's insatiable curiosity got the better of her, and as Detective Cox sashayed towards his jeep, she intercepted him on his way back to the car. "Detective Cox!" Detective Cox turned around and said, "Oh, it's you. I might have guessed." Sharon put her hands on her hips and rolled her eyes. "What's that supposed to mean, Detective Cox?" "The name is Robert." "What's that supposed to mean, Robert?" "It means that you think you fancy yourself as a bit of a detective, don't you, Sharon?" "Where the hell did you get that idea from, Robert? I'm as eager as the next person is to find out who killed Freya Warrington, so that they can be put behind bars for the rest of their lives." "Well, it seems your wish has been duly granted," said the detective, giving her a sheepish grin. "Are you serious?" asked Sharon, feeling almost as if she wanted to whoop with joy and jump up and down like an excitable kid. "You've made an arrest, have you?" "We did better than that. We got a full confession. And I have to say it's thanks to you, Sharon, we were able to make the arrest. The evidence you presented to us in Freya's diary was the straw that broke the camel's back." "You're joking! It is who I think it was, then. Was it her flatmate responsible for her death? What's his name? Barry Baldwin. My money was on both Red and this Barry Baldwin fellow being responsible for her death." "It's funny you should say that," said Detective Cox, "because there is a connection between Red and Barry Baldwin. They're both friends, would you believe it?" "You're joking!" "No, I'm not." "So what exactly happened, Detective Cox? Please, don't keep me in suspense." The detective began to chuckle. "You're a very unusual woman, Sharon, I will give you that. You do have an inquisitive curiosity about you. If there were more people around like you, interested in everything going on around them, there would be more crime solved on the beat, I can tell you. Why don't you take a seat in my jeep? I can tell you're bursting to find out what happened, so I'll tell you." Sharon sat in the passenger-side seat of the detective's red jeep, and Detective Cox rubbed his chin. "Well, where shall I start? We arrested Barry Baldwin, you'll be glad to know. He claimed that the only reason that Freya Warrington wanted to share a flat with him was because she fancied the pants off him." Sharon gasped. "He said that? He's delusional. I mean, Freya wanted a safe place to live in the city in order to commute to her graphic designing job. She thought sharing a flat with a man who claimed to have a girlfriend would be a suitable flat share. She had absolutely no interest in Barry Baldwin, and certainly if she had been interested in him like that, she'd have never moved in with him." "Well, he is delusional," said Detective Cox. "Believe me, I've been interviewing him. I've never met anyone more delusional. I think he lives in his own fantasy world. He believes Freya moved in with him because she really liked him. I mean, think about that for a moment. It is rather bizarre. He said there was a spark between the two of them, and he knew the real reason she wanted to share his apartment with him was because she wanted a relationship with him, which is incredibly presumptuous." "You're telling me," said Sharon, looking aghast. "He confessed that he would go into her room every night, using something you can burn that makes people very sleepy. He had a spare key. He'd stand there watching Freya sleep." "That is so creepy, and it's disgusting. Why did he do that? It's such an invasion of privacy, isn't it?" "It sure is. He said he liked to watch Freya when she was sleeping. He thought she was beautiful, and believed, as she was sharing the apartment with him, that they had some kind of intimate connection. That is what he told himself.
That is sick. Seriously sick.
Of course it's sick. He was furious when Freya changed the keys to her bedroom lock, and began to tell him she was not his girlfriend. That made him raging mad. And so when she disappeared out of his flat, leaving all but a note, he swore to himself if he ever saw the bitch again, that's what he called her, those are not my words, he would strangle her.
So he found out where Freya was living, is that it?
Not exactly, said Detective Cox. Believe it or not, he was going to see Red for some drinks one night, and as he was driving into the parking lot, he saw Freya's car pulling into the lot at the same time. He couldn't believe his luck. He grabbed an electric cord from the trunk of his car, and he jumped her in the corridor and strangled her to death, and then went off to have drinks with Red, as if nothing had happened. And, of course, you know the rest of the story. Red discovered her corpse and called the police. I know you don't like him, Sharon, but the man himself is harmless. But let's just say he's got questionable friends, like Barry Baldwin.
Thank God you got him! That's all I can say, said Sharon, running a hand through her hair. Talk about being at the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean, if Freya had chosen to spend the weekend with her parents, which was her initial intention, none of this would have happened.
Detective Cox nodded in agreement. In my profession, Sharon, I find it a lot. That sometimes it's all down to the timing. And as you say, being in the wrong place at the wrong time can be devastating.
Did Barry Baldwin express any remorse as to what he'd done? Asked Sharon, fixing her steely gaze on Detective Cox.
He said he was glad that she was dead because she was a tease, and women like her needed to be put out of their misery.
For a moment a quietness descended across the car, and then Sharon said, Am I going to see you again, Detective, or is this it?
What are you talking about, Sharon? Asked Detective Cox, fixing his gaze on the attractive, earnest pair of eyes that were now searching his.
Well, now your investigation is over, I mean. I won't see you again, will I? That's what I'm saying.
Detective Cox raised a brow. Does that sadden you, Sharon? The thought of not seeing me again? I'd have thought you'd be glad to be rid of me. No one likes to be woken up at ungodly hours of the night, do they? You didn't look best pleased to see me when you answered the door in your kiddie's pyjamas, he chuckled.
You're going to make fun of my pyjamas, are you? I'll have you know they're incredibly comfortable. That's why I wear them.
Of course I'm not making fun of your pyjamas, Sharon. If you must know, I thought they were rather endearing. So you say you like seeing me, said the detective, chuckling. Am I supposed to read in between the lines here? Is there some kind of hidden message that I'm supposed to decipher?
You're a detective, aren't you? That's what you do for a living. You pick up on the silent messages, the body language, the inner nudges. You don't need it spelling out, do you, Detective? I like you. I'll be blunt.
You like me, Sharon? Well, I don't know what to say to that.
Well, it would be nice if you said you like me too. Or am I just being delusional, like Barry Barlow, believing there's a spark between us when there actually isn't?
Don't put words in my mouth, Sharon. Who says there isn't a spark between us? I think there is a spark, and it needs investigating to see where it leads, don't you think? How about dinner tomorrow night?
He bent down to kiss Sharon on the cheek and whispered in her ear,
I like you too. I liked you from the moment I opened the door and found you standing there in your cute pyjamas.
You did? Asked Sharon.
Well, who doesn't like Little Red Riding Hood and the 12 Dwarfs, he teased.
1 year later, Detective Cox had never been more happy, because now here he was, hand in hand with his beautiful wife on a golden beach in Hawaii, surrounded by the idyllic turquoise ocean. He believed he was the luckiest man in the world to be making Sharon his wife. It had been a private ceremony with a few select guests, the Warringtons being among them. Mr. Warrington got up to speak.
My daughter Freya died so tragically, but it was Detective Cox who brought the case to a close, and the evil man was arrested. Detective Cox has been a good friend of our family's, helping us through some of the lowest times in our lives. But out of the chaotic aftermath and upheaval of my daughter's demise, her friend Sharon and Detective Cox crossed paths together. That would never have happened without my daughter. So even when something dies, it can bring forth a harvest of new fruit. It is our honor to celebrate this union of two very special people coming together like this." Everyone cheered, and the bride and groom embraced each other in a warm hug, for they knew it was true that without Freya Warrington they might never have met, and such a thought did not escape their minds. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. And what a fascinating encounter. Oh my word, what a beautiful story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.